Order. I will let the chamber clear as quickly as possible. Quietly and quickly. Thank you. We now come to the general debate on Ukraine. I call the Deputy Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, to move.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, all across the House condemned Putin's invasion in 2022. The whole House has supported Britain's actions to back Ukraine and galvanise the international community. And today, I hope the whole House echoes the words of the Prime Minister as he pledged £3 billion in military aid for Ukraine every year until 2030 and beyond if necessary. He said Ukraine is not alone and Ukraine will never be alone. Madam Deputy Speaker, the war has entered its third year. In the last few months, Russia has been eking out small territorial gains in the Donbass. Now the Kremlin is probing Ukrainian defences north of Kharkiv. They are unlikely to take Ukraine's second largest city any time soon. But in recent days, they have taken a dozen villages, so we are at a difficult moment which underlines the critical importance of accelerating the delivery of vital military support to Ukraine. And across the country, Russian missiles are raining down on Ukrainian power plants and the electricity grid. Ukraine continues to strike back, including with clear success in degrading Russia's Black Sea Fleet and taking out military targets inside Russia. Increases in American, UK and European military aid are now arriving at the front, and the costs for Russia remain extraordinarily high. 465,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since February 2022, with thousands of conscripts having their lives tossed away for the sake of only modest tactical advances. Meanwhile, Russia's military now sucks up over 40% of government spending. Over half of Russia's national wealth fund has now gone, and Gazprom has posted its first annual loss in 20 years to the tune of $7 billion. Every ruble that the Kremlin spends on a dodgy North Korean missile or Iranian drone is money they are not spending on improving the lives of Russian citizens, on teachers and pensions and medicine. And President... I will.
I've always been sceptical about the impact of sanctions when real war fighting breaks out. And that scepticism has recently been increased by the knowledge that so much Russian oil has been going to India to be refined there and then to be bought up by Western countries that are sanctioning Russian oil. Can the Deputy Foreign Minister throw any light on this and what we propose to do about it?
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with knowledge and authority on this matter. He will know that the imposition of sanctions is a complex matter and that we have to continually ensure that those who break them are held to account, and that is, I believe the correct jargon is, an iterative process. But what I can tell him is that we've sanctioned over 2,000 individuals and entities, and that without sanctions, Russia would have an extra £400 billion with which to prosecute the war. Now, President Putin surely knows that this is... I will give way, yeah.
I'm very grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way. And can I just concur with the chair of the ISC who said it's not just about oil, it's also about sanctions being broken. And what more can we do to stop, for example, UK and European companies who quite clearly are exporting their product via other countries, particularly Turkey and the stands, to bypass those sanctions?
Well, I refer him to my answer to my right honourable friend, but this is a highly complex area. It must always be governed by law, including international law, and we are working better all the time. We get better at it, and he will, I hope, accept my assurance that we are doing everything we can to make sure that we do get better at it and more effective. I give way to the honourable lady.
Thank you very much. I was also going to make a very similar point to that, because I understood that following some of Ed Conway from Sky's reports on motor manufacturing and diversion through Azerbaijan, for example, that the FCDO was going to take some action on this. Is he able to update the House on what action precisely the FCDO is taking to deal with this very blatant sanctions evasion?
I hope very much that the honourable lady will forgive me if I don't give those details across the floor of the House, but at such point as it would be helpful and we are able to say so, I will assuredly inform the House. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, President Putin surely knows that this is not sustainable. He will not be able to outlast the Ukrainians who are fighting for their very survival, or Ukraine's supporters with economies 25 times the size of his. And the House will be aware the situation on our front line is difficult. Russia has numerical advantages in men and materiel, and we are acting now to help Ukraine hold the line and get back on the front foot. I will.
I'm very grateful. My anxiety is that all the figures he gave about what the Russian economy is doing would indicate that Russia has put the production of ammunition and materiel on a war footing. But everything I've heard from our Western allies is that we have chosen not to do that. It feels as if we give bits and pieces here, there and everywhere, all well-intentioned, but it doesn't add up to us putting the whole of the Western military armament process on a war footing, because that is surely what we need to do.
I say to the honourable gentleman, for whom I have a very high regard, that when I have finished my speech, I hope he will be reassured specifically on that point. No, I will, yes.
I thank the Deputy Foreign Secretary for giving way. He's talked about the numerical advantage Russia has over Ukraine. That is why it is so important that troops at the front line in Ukraine who are injured are treated and cared for and recycled back into active service as quick as possible. In Gould, we're very proud to have provided over 150 ambulances, including armoured ambulances, which are being used at the front. So the Deputy Foreign Secretary spoke about military aid. Can you assure the House that we're also doing everything we can to ensure that proper medical aid and support is being provided to those brave troops?
Yes, and I'm extremely grateful to his constituents for the work that he described. And again, if he will bear with me, I will be able to come directly to the point that he has made. It is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, to restate what is at stake. No one here in Britain, or indeed in the wider world, should be in any doubt. It is vital, not just for Ukraine, whose determination to fight for their freedom is undimmed, but for us in Britain and beyond. This is the defining struggle of our generation, Madam Deputy Speaker. At stake in Ukraine are vital principles. These are not just words found in the United Nations Charter, a charter signed by Russia, but which she now flagrantly breaks and dishonours. They are essential foundations for the security and prosperity of the entire world. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, right, not might. The war has brought the greatest atrocities on our continent in a generation. The death, rape, torture and deportation of civilians on a massive scale. And we see the war's impact spread across Europe, even to our own shores. Espionage, cyber attacks, disinformation, suspected sabotage activity, airspace violations and GPS jamming, which impacts civil aviation. And if, Madam Deputy Speaker, Russia were to win in Ukraine, we would be back in a world where the most fundamental international rule, that countries must not seize land from others or resolve disputes by force, would be in shreds. Success would only embolden Putin and authoritarian leaders around the world with designs on their neighbours' territory. So the costs of supporting Ukraine now are far less than the costs we will face if they do not repel the invaders. And this is why the government has identified Russia as the most acute threat to British security, and why there has been an enduring cross-party and public support in Britain for Ukraine since those little green men first appeared in 2014. And it is why we have seen NATO only grow stronger since the Russian invasion, with Sweden and Finland joining an alliance dedicated solely to defending territory, not taking territory. And why we have seen the American Congress decide last month to approve $60 billion in further US support for Ukraine, and the EU announcing €50 billion in multi-year support. And that is why, despite the different pressures some partners face, none but the most isolated and fanatically anti-Western states seek to defend Putin's blatant violation of the UN Charter. And this isolation, Madam Deputy Speaker, is Moscow's greatest weakness. Diplomatically, economically, militarily, the balance of advantage lies not with Russia, but with Ukraine and her supporters, and we have to make that advantage count. I will.
Can I thank the Minister very much for his very positive attitude that he's taken, and we're very much encouraged by what the Right Honourable Gentleman has said. It's very important that, first of all, that Ukraine gets the military aid that it needs, but it's also important that the troops are rotated. I understand that's one of the issues, because the troops in the front line, under pressure all the time, need a bit of respite. What discussions has the Minister been able to have with the Ukrainian army to ensure that the militarily and also respite-wise and relaxation-wise there is help for them?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and he may rest assured that British military advice in that respect and in much else as well is not lacking. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was saying that we have to make this advantage count of Moscow's greatest weakness, diplomatically, economically and militarily. And so we and our allies and partners need to outcompete. We need to out-cooperate, and we need to out-innovate. Ukraine can and will win, provided we support them enough, fast enough, and for long enough. And the key priorities are clear. Kyiv needs immediate military aid, particularly ammunition and air defence, to defend the front line and protect its vital infrastructure. 1 month ago today, the Prime Minister announced our largest ever single package of equipment to help push the Russians back on land, sea and air. Much of this vital kit is already in Ukraine, including, I can inform the House, 1 million new rounds of ammunition. And in April, we sent vital spare parts to keep Ukrainian equipment in the fight, with more to follow in the coming weeks, including over 20 mine clearance systems to defeat Russian minefields. This year alone, Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain has given more than 1,600 strike and air defence missiles, as well as more Storm Shadow long-range precision-guided missiles, £245 million for artillery ammunition, and £325 million programme for drone production and procurement, and £20 million of emergency funding to repair energy infrastructure. Since June 2022, we have trained 40,000 Ukrainians under Operation Interflex, and we are encouraging partners to join us in ensuring Ukraine can counter the immediate threat. I give way.
I'm very grateful, and I absolutely support all that he's saying in terms of the military equipment and so on to support Ukraine in their efforts. But I get back to previous questions. Surely it needs to be a two-pronged approach in terms of the sanctions to put economic pressure on Russia, as well as military pressure. It can't be just one on its own. So does the Deputy Foreign Secretary think we should be reviewing the effectiveness of the sanctions or potentially extending them?
Well, she is absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to say that you need to do both, and we are doing both, and sometimes it is frustrating that we are not able to talk directly to this point in the House, but she may rest assured that we are using the sanctions regime in every way we can, and that we are getting better at it as time goes by and events unfold. Now, I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are encouraging partners to join us in ensuring Ukraine can counter these threats. That means more ammunition and long-range missiles, more funding and munitions for air defence, more emergency support for energy infrastructure. But we also need to focus on the longer term, making our strength count in a prolonged war. We will move, Madam Deputy Speaker, to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade, the biggest investment in defence in a generation. We will maintain current levels of military aid for Ukraine, $3 billion a year, until the end of the decade, or longer if needed, and we call on others to join us in this pledge. And we have promised to double our investment in munitions production, £10 billion over the next 10 years, giving industry the long-term certainty it needs to build extra production capacity. And we are also strengthening Ukraine's own defence industrial base, with 29 defence businesses, our largest trading mission ever since Russia's full-scale invasion, visiting Kyiv in April. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Being very generous, and I think the point that he's just made does go some way to reassuring me, but I think we will still need to go considerably further on production of arms for Ukraine. Can I ask him, though, about the long-term future of Ukraine, because it needs to rebuild itself, and it's making choices between spending money on armaments itself or on rebuilding tower blocks that have been blown up. Why have we still not managed to get the £3 billion from the sale of Chelsea Football Club to Ukraine? And why have we still not managed to get any of the assets of the Russian state, which are sitting in European and British banks, through to Ukraine to help rebuild?
So on his second point, I hope very much that progress will be made imminently at the G7 meeting later this week. Things are moving in the right direction, and we must hope that they are successful, which will answer his second point by the end of the week. On the so-called Chelsea fund, he is right in what he says, and he reflects the immense frustration many of us have found over the last year in trying to get this fund up and running. The Foreign Secretary is absolutely determined that we will do so. It will be the second largest charity in Britain after the Wellcome Foundation. Every sinew is being bent to get it to operate. It is mired in legal and technical difficulties, but he has my personal assurance we are doing everything to try and make sure that money is used to good effect. Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. The news that he's given the House this afternoon is greatly encouraging, the amount of military equipment and money that's going into Ukraine. But Britain has courageously led the world in coordinating the effort against the Russians' operation in Ukraine, supported, of course, by the Americans and, to be fair, the Germans. But we three nations cannot do it all. So what is my right honourable friend doing to encourage other richer nations and allies around the world to contribute their share?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to underline the importance of that, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think the position is a little better than he is suggesting, but he may rest assured that we are pressing everyone to give the support that Britain is giving in whatever way they can. I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the 29 defence businesses that went to Kyiv in April. We are continuing to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia. With the US, we have taken decisive steps against the global trade in Russian metals. We are bearing down, as I said to my right honourable friend, on the circumvention of sanctions, and as the House knows, this was a major focus during the Foreign Secretary's recent visit to Central Asia, and we are adopting new measures to target the shadow fleet that transports Russian oil. We have also consistently said Russia must pay the price for their illegal invasion. Ahead of the G7 summit in June, we've been leading international efforts to build consensus on a lawful route to use Russian assets to generate the maximum possible support for Ukraine. We are again working with our partners so they join us in giving Ukraine the support needed long-term to win this war, ramping up defence production, supporting Ukraine's own industry, and imposing more sanctions to undermine Russia's military-industrial complex and reduce its export revenues. Finally, we need to invest in Ukraine's future security and prosperity, not only by backing them in the war, but backing them after it. And last year's London Recovery Conference raised $60 billion for Ukraine. In January, Britain was the first to sign an agreement offering bilateral security commitments to Ukraine following the Vilnius Declaration. And now we are the first to commit to multi-year military support for as long as it is needed. I will in a moment. We are seeing encouraging signs of many partners making similar investments. The Americans and the European Union have agreed generous funding packages. Germany will host the next Ukraine Recovery Conference in June, and our main NATO allies and G7 partners are now following us in signing long-term security agreements with Ukraine. In July at the NATO summit in Washington and the European Political Community Summit at Blenheim Palace, we will be urging our partners to underline once again our unity in standing with Ukraine, which I hope will satisfy my honourable friend. Very good point that he made a few moments ago. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Deputy Foreign Secretary for giving way, and he lays out the plans for a war that will go on for many years. Can he explain to the House how Ukraine, with a starting population of 41 million, which is probably halved now by emigration and those who've been killed in the war, is possibly, in a war of attrition, a long-term war of attrition, going to succeed against Russia with a population of 144 million without NATO boots on the ground? And is that the end game of this situation?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman should reflect on what I said at the beginning of my speech, that the gross domestic product, the gross national income of those who are united against what Russia has done in Ukraine very greatly exceeds all the assets that Russia has. Madam Deputy Speaker, earlier this month, I'm not giving way again. Madam Deputy Speaker, earlier this month, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Edinburgh was the first member of the royal family to visit Ukraine since Putin's invasion. She followed in the footsteps of Geoffrey of Wessex, an Anglo-Saxon princess who married the Grand Prince of Kiev, one of many figures in British history to have forged links with Ukraine over the centuries. Today, we are seeing, not only on security, but in areas ranging from English language training for civil servants to green technology, a greater breadth and depth of cooperation than ever before. I will indeed give way to my...
I'm very pleased to hear the cooperation which my right honourable friend is setting out, and indeed his positive message. But so far he hasn't acknowledged the role of the Ukrainian diaspora here in the UK in terms not only of the support that they've given for those back home, but also the very important role that they do in mobilising public opinion here in the UK in support of what this country and others are trying to do to ensure that Russia does not win this war.
My honourable friend is entirely right to make that point. The contribution of the Ukrainian community here in Britain, those who have come here, has been immense in terms of awareness raising. I remember with the greatest possible affection the concert that took place in Wild Green in my constituency, where a young Ukrainian opera singer sang the national anthem At the end of that concert, everyone who had the privilege of being there was fully aware about the dreadful sufferings that Ukraine was experiencing. Madam Deputy Speaker, during his recent visit, the Foreign Secretary launched negotiations on an enhanced 100-year partnership with Ukraine. Our friendship with Ukraine is not only enduring, it is growing stronger. We will stand with Ukraine's people until they prevail in the war, and we are confident that they will enjoy a future that is secure, prosperous and free. Ukraine's cause is just. It matters to Britain. The consequences of Ukraine failing are unconscionable. Our friends and enemies alike are watching to see if we have the necessary resolve to see this through to the end. Let no one believe that if Putin succeeded in his illegal invasion and conquered Ukraine, he would stop there. Emboldened by victory, the failure of the West, of Europe, America and of our own country would define our generation's inability to deliver the collective security we have championed continuously since 1945. The cost to us all of this failure would be many, many times the financial costs we are bearing today in delivering the necessary military support. This support must continue if we are to maintain that collective security, the rule of law, and the international rules-based system upon which the stability and success of future generations depend. The people of Ukraine have shown extraordinary bravery and determination in resisting Putin's vile war machine. We cannot, we must not let them down.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Deputy Foreign Minister for advance sight of his statement, as well as the Foreign Secretary for his help in facilitating my visit with the Shadow Defence Secretary to Ukraine last week. As Russia's new Kharkiv offensive began, we visited Kyiv to show our solidarity with Ukrainian people and its government. They have shown incredible courage throughout this war, and on both sides in this House and across the United Kingdom, we are united behind Ukraine. Madam Deputy Speaker, I must tell you how important it is to face down Putin for what he has done. Outside of the capital, I drove with the Shadow Defence Secretary to Bucha and Irpin, where hundreds were killed and mass graves were discovered. We spoke with children kidnapped from Kherson and sent to Russian camps. Children who were told that Ukraine no longer exists. My right honourable friends, this is Vladimir Putin's intention. More than 800 days on, Ukraine is still standing, still fighting. Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike have shown courage and bravery that demonstrates a 21st century blitz spirit. They have successfully taken back over 50% of Russian-held territory and destroyed a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is more than Ukrainian resilience. This is Ukrainian success. We saw it in Kyiv. We saw innovation, which is flourishing. Startups are flourishing, driving forward advances in defence, in health and veteran support. I only wish, in a way, that our media covered more of what the Ukrainian people are doing on the ground, every single one of them. We met mothers, daughters, whose fathers are on the front, doing all that they can to help in that defence of their nation. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, we had one simple message on our visit. If there is a change in government and we are successful in the election later this year, there will be no change in Britain's resolve to stand with Ukraine, confront Russian aggression and pursue Putin for his war crimes. We told the Defence Minister Umerov and the Foreign Minister Kuleba and President Zelensky's head of office Yermak that this is Labour's guarantee to Ukraine, and it's why we have fully backed the government's increased commitment for Ukraine this year and for the years ahead. The conflict, as the Deputy Foreign Secretary has said, is at a critical moment. Not only because of Putin's new attacks around Kharkiv and across the front line, but because this is an election year here in the United Kingdom, across much of Europe, and of course in the United States. I said this before at this dispatch box, but it's clear that Putin sees democracy as the weakness of the West, and he believes, frankly, that he can outlast us. We must show him that our democracy is in fact our strength, and that we do not give in to any short-termism in our approach. And it's our determination to defend freedom that will keep us united with our allies and behind Ukraine. As has been said, Putin's war is not only a military one, but it's also diplomatic, an economic, and most definitely an industrial one. He has successfully moved his industry to a wartime footing and is spending 40% of his government's budget now on defence. And we've seen him deepening bonds in Beijing, in Tehran and Pyongyang. And China is increasing its support for the Russian war machine. It's coming perilously close to throwing its lot in with Putin's coalition. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the truth about Vladimir Putin, and why I called him recently the ringleader of a new form of fascism. He will never make peace if he thinks that he can win on the battlefield, and never stop if he is not defeated in Ukraine. Now is the time for us to show our commitment to supporting Ukraine, and that commitment runs deeper than Putin's commitment to invading it. Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Minister explain if he is ready to join with Labour and take 3 immediate steps which Ukrainians asked us to take back to London? The first is, they said to us across the board that deliveries need to speed up and reach the front line, especially the welcome packages of military aid from both the UK and, of course, the United States that was promised in recent weeks. Ukrainians are especially in need of air defences, deep strike missiles and ammunition. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, but now. And NATO allies that can send more, frankly, should. The second point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I just want to question the Deputy Foreign Secretary on and ask him if he agrees, is that UK diplomacy should be accelerated to maintain unity for Ukraine and further isolate Putin. We are entering a vital period of diplomacy in the next few weeks. It includes, of course, the G7, NATO 75, the UK-led European political community at Blenheim Palace, and Ukraine's peace summit that they are putting so much stock in. And it's vital that at that peace summit we see members from the global south, strengthening support for Ukraine, seizing frozen Russian state assets for Ukraine's recovery, and closing the sanction loopholes that I think so many across the House have raised in this debate today. These must be priorities for our Prime Minister. I noted what he said about that peace summit, but can I ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary to confirm whether or not our Prime Minister has finally committed his attendance to Ukraine's peace summit next month? He must not only attend, but use Britain's diplomatic leverage to encourage the widest possible coalition of countries to join. It is important that countries like India, like Brazil, are there in sufficient numbers. In June last year, Labour passed a motion in this House calling on the government to finally set out within 90 days how they intend to seize, rather than just freeze, Russian state assets for the purpose of supporting Ukraine's reconstruction. The United States, Canada, and other countries are moving forward on this. The UK appears to be watching. So can the Deputy Foreign Secretary set out what steps are in fact being taken in concert with our G7 partners to finally move this forward and make clear to the international community that we will hold Russia responsible for the perpetration of this illegal war?
Will my friend allow? I'm very grateful. He will know that it is perfectly possible that if there is some kind of agreement that comes at the G7, which we're hopeful for, that we may need legislation. My anxiety is we would want to get that legislation on the statute books as fast as possible. Obviously, we need to get it right. But I'm sure we on this side of the House would want to do everything to help the government, if necessary, to get legislation through before the summer recess, or certainly before a general election. I hope I'm not speaking above my pay grade from the backbenches, but I hope that that's the position that the Labour Party will be adopting.
My right honourable friend is right to press this issue, as he has now for many months, and it's why I press the Deputy Foreign Secretary. We would have thought as an opposition that we would be further forward at this stage. We recognise that the G7 meeting is critical. You absolutely have our undertaking to support that endeavour, but I think we all understand in relation as we hurtle to the recess at this period, and then as we anticipate a general election this year, we are running out of time, and it makes the point that I have made and my right honourable friend has made absolutely fundamental, and I hope the Deputy Foreign Secretary might say a bit more about that. Madam Deputy Speaker,
I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary very much for making a speech which shows the unity of the House, and quite rightly he is pressing the government on a number of issues. May I say to him that I think when the opposition does support the government in a matter as important as this, it gives much added force and emphasis to it. On the specific questions he has asked, my honourable friend, the Defence Minister, will respond when he comes to wind up the debate. I think the House has heard enough from me today, but he will respond, and of course if there are any remaining issues after that, he and I will be able to speak behind the Speaker's chair. But on all these points, particularly on the issue of sanctions and moving together with other countries to try and ensure we are able to impose very serious financial penalties on Russia, I give him my assurance we are moving as fast as we can. It involves many complex legal issues, and it also involves us getting agreement across the G7 and wider as well. We are doing everything we possibly can.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for that undertaking. The whole House will have heard it. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Office for Financial and Sanctions Implementation website reflects that the latest financial penalty on any UK sanctions regime that was levied in August of last year. It is the only penalty issued on the Russian regime since this war began. I mean, I say to the Deputy Foreign Secretary, how can that be? And having just come back, we have to do better than just rhetoric and statements from this dispatch book. It has to be there with action. Just one since the war began. And I would be grateful if the Minister would address this point. I think the whole House needs to. I'm grateful.
So it's not a surprise that the honourable gentleman is asking precisely the same questions as I, as the Minister, asked of Ofsted. And what Ofsted say is that financial investigations take a frustrating length of time to deliver. They assess every report of new complaints. But I can tell him that I expect the first monetary penalties will come during this year. We must comply with the law, but in result to my asking exactly the same questions that he has been asking, I am told that those financial penalties are in the mix, and we will hear shortly, and in any case during this year.
I know that the Deputy Foreign Secretary is doing his best. But can I just say, on the issue of repurposing of state assets, again we're told, just wait, we'll get there. Got a G7 meeting, we'll get there. I say to him very gently, we are the country of the rule of law. We do not wait for others to get there. And I say, with the City of London, we must be able to do better than this. And I just put him on notice that if we win the next general election, we will review these powers, because we are determined to see this enforcement happen. If our allies in the United States can do it at speed, then this great country can do it at speed as well. And of course I did.
Very grateful for my right honourable friend giving way, but isn't it clear, and many NGOs have already got the evidence there, that what we're seeing is exports from this country and other parts of Europe through Turkey, through Azerbaijan, through China, for example, which are quite clearly not end-user destinations, but are then being moved to Russia. I'm told, for example, that Bentley cars are still available within Moscow. Now, if that's the case, where are they being exported through? Quite clearly through places like China and Azerbaijan.
Well, my honourable friend conveys the kind of loophole after loophole after loophole that countless journalists have pointed out, countless members of the public can see. And he knows, the Deputy Foreign Secretary knows this. It is rather embarrassing when you're in Ukraine with people who are putting their lives on the line that this is still happening. We've got to crack it. We can crack it. And I hope we'll crack it at speed now. Third, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just say, does the Deputy Foreign Secretary agree that we have to boost, and the Shadow Defence Secretary has returned to this subject over and over and over again, we have to boost industrial production. The $2 billion for restocking Ukraine and for our armed forces must be fast-tracked. The UK's defence industrial strategy must be rebooted to grow our defence base at home and drive collaboration with our allies. In particular, the United Kingdom and Ukrainian defence companies should be launching new programmes at this time to jointly supply the most advanced technology to both our countries. This election year, we're committed in the Labour Party to take the politics out of any support for Kyiv and for Ukraine. I've pushed the Deputy Foreign Secretary and the government on these issues in a spirit of working together on this issue, and will remain determined to work together. And he would have sensed these questions are actually coming from all sides of the House. We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes to win. That is our commitment from Labour benches. We are determined that Vladimir Putin does not get his way.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is deeply encouraging to hear what unites the two front benches about the support for Ukraine, and whatever differences there are, there are differences and concerns that are expressed by people of all political parties or of no political parties. And I very much welcome the tone of the debate. The Prime Minister was right to warn that the next few years will be some of the most dangerous in our country has ever known, and right to refer to an axis of authoritarian states of Russia, Iran, North Korea and China as a direct threat to global stability and global peace. Whether we like it or not, war has returned to Europe. Our Eastern NATO allies are right to warn that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, they might be next. After all, Putin is explicit that his war in Ukraine is against NATO and the West. The strategic situation is far from satisfactory, but we are at a turning point, but it hinges on how US policy now develops. And this was something that my right honourable friend did not address at all in his remarks, and I would be grateful if it could be addressed in the summing up. Firstly, the Russian military may be running out of equipment more rapidly than we think, and their economy is more fragile than its hydrocarbon revenue would make it appear. However, Russia is still able to sustain massive casualties, and the Russian population is still supporting the war. Russia has accepted a subservient position in its relationship with China to ensure continued Chinese economic and technological support for the duration of the war. The US and Europe are distracted from Ukraine by Gaza and other theatres such as the Sahel and New Caledonia, where Azerbaijan appears to be manoeuvring against French interests. US domestic politics delayed aid to Ukraine by 6 months, a delay which Russia is exploiting, albeit with massive losses in personnel and equipment. This delay has offered Putin an opportunity to gain an advantage on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. But the biggest danger is that Putin will win the war in the diplomatic battlefield, which is more a contest of wills, not of military supremacy. Putin still believes that he can wear down the West's will to support Ukraine before the Russian will to fight fails. Ukraine is now under significantly increased military and political pressure. However, the re-establishment of the US aid, strong statements from the UK and others, coupled with the battlefield losses, all have forced Putin to take domestic measures to enable Russia to continue fighting indefinitely. The appointment of the economist Byelusov, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, as Defence Minister, marks a decision to increase the level of militarisation of Russia's economy, putting it further onto a war footing. The new minister will have the job of doing this, but also of making sure that these measures do not destroy Russia's economy as they did in Soviet times. Any change programme, and Byelusov's appointment indicates a significant change in Russia, creates a temporary weakness in the organisation being changed. Russia is compensating for this weakness by stepping up hybrid warfare attacks on the West, and which could include assassination. And I don't think we should rule out some Russian involvement in the recent attempt on the life of the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, who may be identified widely as a pro-Russian supporter, but he is not. Official US policy is still not robust enough. President Biden does not want to allow Ukraine to lose, but nor does he want to empower Ukraine to the extent that it could inflict a crippling and destabilising defeat on Russia. The US is treating this like a regional crisis, which has to be managed. But war is war, not just a crisis, and this war is part of a global crisis, global conflict. A war must be won far more than the war will be lost. Ukraine rightly complains that the US will not allow the weapons it supplies to Ukraine to be used to hit targets on Russian soil. And I'm sure that the Shadow Foreign Secretary and the Shadow Defence Secretary encountered this frustration when they were there. So before the recent advance towards Kharkiv, the Ukrainians had to watch the Russians build up their forces on the Russian side of the border without being able to use US weapons to disrupt them. This Russian advance on Kharkiv demonstrates, and this is the elephant in the room, that US policy of limiting weapons use is totally illogical. It puts into jeopardy President Biden's own policy of preventing Ukraine from losing. It makes this a critical turning point. During a visit to Kiev on the 15th of May, United States Secretary of State Blinken said in a speech, and I quote, "Ukraine has to make decisions for itself about how it's going to conduct this war." Did this indicate a tacit change of policy? When my noble friend, the Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, announced that Ukraine could use British weapons to hit Russian soil, it provoked a huge reaction from Russia, obviously designed to put others off saying the same thing. Blinken's statement produced no reaction at all, except Russia's advance stopped when it could have made further progress. 2 days after Secretary of State Blinken's statement, on Friday the 17th, the Ukrainians launched one of the largest drone and missile attacks on Russian targets in occupied territory, and also in Russia itself, accompanied on the 16th and 18th by massive attacks on Crimea. Secretary of State Blinken's statement could indicate the first steps towards a significant change in US policy to allow Ukraine to use US weapons against targets on Russian soil, reflecting the realization of at least some within the administration that Ukraine must be enabled to win to expel Russia from its territory. We do not know. And I wonder if my Right Honourable friend in his reply could address this question. There could be other reasons, such as record daily Russian casualties in their recent attacks. If US policy is not changing, then there will be a de facto stabilisation of the front line with Russia in a stronger physical and psychological position than before, despite having achieved little of operational importance in terms of territory and at significant cost in lives and equipment. I give way to my honourable friend.
Nothing justifies what Putin has done, but what worries me about all this is what happens if the most likely outcome materialises, namely a stalemate. Won't there be many people in Europe, like President Macron and others, who will say we have to start negotiations? So what's going to be our attitude then, does my honourable friend think?
Well, it's an unthinkable prospect. A stalemate would be a defeat. A stalemate would be a victory for Putin. He would be holding territory that he has claimed illegally. And I thought my right honourable friend, the Deputy Foreign Secretary, was very clearly in that, and supported by the Shadow Foreign Secretary in the same terms. So I don't think we should be talking about defeat. We should be concentrating on how we make sure that we can expel Russia from all the occupied Ukrainian territory. But if the Ukrainians' hands are tied, they cannot use US weapons to strike targets in Russia itself, then they will remain vulnerable to further Russian attacks. Russia will appear stronger than it really is, having obscured its growing deficiency in weaponry. Russia would be able to continue to keep up moderate military pressure on Ukraine to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to benefit from an operational pause. In other words, the Russians will have the upper hand, I say to my honourable friend who intervened a moment ago. Russia will also step up its information warfare and influence campaign in Europe, employing hybrid and grey zone attacks. Worse, by the US failing to call Russia's nuclear bluff, because that's what this amounts to, this policy, other states, most immediately in the Middle East, will increasingly see nuclear weapons as conferring invulnerability. In the last few days, it has been reported that Iran is willing to share nuclear technology with neighbouring countries. This proves how the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is ineffective. We should be more honest about this. Too many governments in the West cling to the illusion that it can lead to a world free of nuclear weapons. Even European countries beyond the UK and France may soon have to consider acquiring nuclear capability, or at least accepting US tactical nuclear weapons on their soil once again. Gaza has put Western influence in the Middle East in free fall. It also ties up Western political attention and US military supplies and helps the Russian narrative to become dominant in the global south. Russia's information efforts have played their part in making Gaza a debilitating issue for the West, and interventions in other theatres, such as in New Caledonia, keep the West on the back foot. The Russia-China, North Korean, Iran axis is strengthening. The temporary stabilisation on the front line in Ukraine means that Western European countries have still not yet had sufficient stimulus to make them appreciate the importance and urgency of going onto a wartime footing themselves and increasing their own defensive capacities. If the US is in fact changing its policy, as I indicated it might be earlier, it is a serious game changer and we must encourage it. It gives notice to Putin that eventually he will lose the war. The US can re-establish the credibility of its leadership of the democratic world under NATO. The Chinese will draw an important lesson about US resolve, which will have significant implications for Taiwan. The Russian model will appear much less attractive to the global south, and Russian influence will wane. And the impetus towards nuclear proliferation will also lessen. Sadly, some European countries will feel let off the hook, and it will be harder to galvanise a united European defence effort. So what can now the UK do? Sadly, even in the UK, we are still reacting too slowly. The Prime Minister told the Liaison Committee in December that the Ukraine war was, quotes, existential for Euro-Atlantic security, unquote. But there is little sign of this understanding in our day-to-day politics. The Defence Secretary has said the UK defence industry must be put onto a war footing, which means that the whole of government must be mobilised for this effort. And our voters must understand that the sacrifices to fund victory in Ukraine will be far less than the costs of defeat for Ukraine in the longer term. The UK should build a cross-party assessment, which I think we have already been built here, of what needs to be done to move the UK by stages onto a war footing and to increase defence capability and capacity rather than simply just talking about increasing the defence budget. Even if we don't have enough kit to send to Ukraine, I'm going to bring my remarks to a close if that's all right. Even if we don't have enough kit to send to Ukraine, we could help them make more kit themselves, and we could significantly improve our training effort, which we now know is not providing Ukrainians with the breadth and depth of training that they need to win this war, and I hope the government will respond to that point. We need to press the White House to understand that Ukraine must be enabled to win this war, or the war is lost, and we must also keep encouraging our European allies to follow suit. We can all learn from the way that countries like Finland and Poland have moved onto a war footing and are building much increased military capacity at less cost.
SNP spokesperson Dave Doogan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin by reinforcing the parliamentary unity that is enjoyed on this issue. We've discussed it between the government and the official opposition. Well, the same applies to the third party in this chamber. Also, the SNP stands fully behind the government's actions with regard to Ukraine, which is something, really, because we don't agree with the government on very much. So when we do, it's obviously an issue of significant importance to our constituents in Scotland and to the message, more importantly, that that delivers to international stakeholders, not the least of whom are in Kyiv and in Moscow in terms of the United Kingdom's position on this. Consensus is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I'm certainly no British nationalist, which I've gone to some effort to demonstrate to you over the last 4 years. But as an impartial observer, perhaps, in the UK's ambitions and activities in Ukraine to date, I would summarise them as a strong start, but flagging and showing some limited ability to endure. And not all of these are financial. I would point out to some tremendously effective decisions that were taken by the former Secretary of State for Defence, that being the issuance of Challenger tanks to Ukraine, of very, very limited tactical use, but tremendously important in terms of the message that it sent out. And I'd like to see the UK government, of whichever department, manifest equally important signals into this conflict that don't actually command particularly huge budgetary sums, because the war continues to be central to Putin's narrative that Russia is under threat and seeks to divert attention from his failing economic and social policies. And we should expect no let-up in this rhetoric from the Kremlin to the bitter cost of Russian and Ukrainian civilians alike. Russia has violated almost all of the significant agreements between Ukraine and NATO. And if the war were to end on unfavourable terms for Ukraine, there is every likelihood that Russia will subsequently be emboldened to use force where they see fit elsewhere. It remains, therefore, essential for European and Western security that Russia's war of aggression fails. So with the current state of the war set as broadly stalemate, with neither side able to attain air superiority, both struggling out to carry out mechanised manoeuvres at scale and challenges in artillery and munition supplies, Russia's wholesale war footing and mobilisation of its industrial base should be a cause for growing concern. We should be concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the combined industrial might of the West cannot keep pace with Russia's ability to manufacture and distribute artillery shells. And so Russia continues to press Ukraine, therefore, along the front line. Ukraine has made strategic gains in the Black Sea, causing the withdrawal of the Russian naval assets there and opening up Western Black Sea grain routes, which is doubtless positive but of limited impact to their territorial defence on the east of the country. Ukraine's recently passed mobilisation law, which came into effect yesterday, makes it easier for them to draft conscripts, provide financial incentives and not include provisions to demobilise troops that have served for more than 3 years. But this should serve as instructive to us in the West as to the pressure they foresee in the months ahead. Russia has significantly mobilised, as I've said, its defence industry, increased labour capacity and expanded production lines of existing facilities, as well as bringing back previously mothballed plants. This is a statement of intent, if ever we saw one. Russia's defence spending in 24 is expected to consume 30% of government spending. Very, very instructive indeed. This has led to significant increases in production output, where Russia is delivering approximately 1,500 tanks to its forces per year, along with 3,000 armoured fighting vehicles. Figures many of us in the West could only imagine being able to stand up. And according to RUSI, 80% of those stocks, while refurbished and modernised, is nevertheless extraordinary undertaking for an economy apparently under sanction. The number of systems held in storage mean that Russia can maintain consistent output through 24 and into 25, but this should be subject to inventory attrition over the period thereafter, and I'd be interested to know if the government is factoring that into their thinking. Very happy to give way.
This is a very realistic speech, and the trouble with this war, as with previous Russia's wars, is that early incompetence is now replaced by a ruthless authoritarian determination to win at any cost and mobilise its entire economy and be utterly impervious to the loss of human life. So the question I put to the honourable gentleman, as I put to the House, is although we may breathe fire and brimstone about how we're determined to win, actually what is happening is stalemate. And I think we just have to work out how we're going to navigate ourselves, how the West is going to navigate itself around a possible peace negotiation with Russia. I'm not saying I want that. Thoroughly unpalatable, not a very popular thing to say, but we have to be realistic.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his contribution. I don't share his logic as he applies it to the potential outcome in Ukraine. I think, as I began, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a position of consensus, I don't think the Deputy Foreign Secretary would share the summation of the honourable gentleman, and I don't share it either, because whatever the size of the bite that Russia takes out of Ukraine, if Ukraine doesn't get it back, then that, any way you cut it, any wrapper you put on it, is a Russian victory. And where Russia prevails, then aggression and tearing up the rules-based international system prevails also. And we cannot allow that to happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say that the strides that they've made in regenerating their heavy armour, it should serve as a wake-up call to UK and Western partners. And Ukraine, to counter that, must have serious supplies of anti-armour. I would like to note that as I'll get on to just shortly, the serious questions over the efficacy of sanctions begs very serious questions about how Russia's missile capabilities are being regenerated at significant cost to Ukraine. We must, Madam Deputy Speaker, ensure the most accurate calibration in the reconciliation of that which Ukraine needs and how the UK and NATO allies can satisfy that unmet demand. Ukraine's key foreign military aid requirements are air defences, long-range missiles and artillery ammunition. Ukraine's shortages in air defence over the past weeks have allowed Russia to conduct a destructive missile campaign against national infrastructure, civilian populations and military targets, including the largest thermal power plant in the Kyiv region. Long-range missiles are required to strike Russian supply depots, command and control centres and military infrastructure. Artillery ammunition is essential for offensive and defensive action on the front line, but this remains in short supply. The US aid package for Ukraine only passed on the 23rd of April, as we all watched months of delay take their toll on the war effort. The battle to get the bill passed has sparked fresh fears that a Republican election victory, a matter of course for the US electorate, could significantly reduce essential US aid to Ukraine. So it's important, nevertheless, that the UK, along with the rest of Europe, have contingency plans for a potential reduced US footprint aid to Ukraine aid. This also highlights the need for long-term planning in military aid pipeline as opposed to pulsing batches. Sanctions, as I said we get on to, are they working and who is suffering? Well, Russian oil products are getting through to the UK despite the UK officially banning the import of Russian oil from the 5th of December 22. But a loophole in the legislation allows Russian oil to continue to flow into the UK, provided it has been refined in a third country into fuel. It's no longer considered to have originated in Russia. This is deeply disingenuous to energy bill payers across the UK, both domestic and commercial, who are facing huge increases in their energy bills due to the price of gas caused by this conflict, while aviation fuel and other distillates from Russian oil continue to pour into the UK's economy unabated. What does the government say to UK taxpayers who are funding billions in military aid to Ukraine to defend themselves from Russian aggression, which, if you follow the money, is part funded by UK purchases of fuel refined from Russian oil? It's desperate stuff, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you don't need to be a forensic accountant to figure this out. UK purchases of fuel from China, India and Turkey, much of which originates from Russian oil, have increased considerably since the sanction regime began. In 2021 to 23, India went up from 402 million to 1.5 billion, China from 30 million to 663 million, and Turkey from 1.8 million to 60 million. How does the government explain this loophole, and will they close it off, and in so doing, close off the revenue to Putin and his war machine at the same time? And not unrelatedly, UK businesses continue to see record growth in exports to Russia's former Soviet state neighbours. A manifold spike which coincides precisely with the introduction of sanctions on goods to Russia. Is the government interested, much less concerned, by this patent economic blip? and reality, because they should be concerned given the possibility that such exports could contain important components for military purposes. And that matters because although Russian missile production has increased since the war began, Russia faces serious vulnerabilities wherein Russia's complex weapons, its most complex weapons, such as missiles, are dependent extensively on Western-sourced components. And this, Madam Deputy Speaker, against a backdrop of a 1,860% increase of UK-manufactured vehicles to Azerbaijan. Is anybody really in the government under any illusions about what's happening there? So Russia, in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, has maintained a steady supply of the necessary components to make these high-end missiles due to an incoherent approach to sanctions adopted by Western states. A less laissez-faire approach to countering the Russian defence industry will help disrupt Russian military supply chains and, in turn, disrupt Russia supply lines. And this must be a strategic priority for all of us who care about the integrity and the future of Ukraine. Thank you.
Jack Lopresti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is day 116 of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, Russian forces have grown increasingly capable in the months since October. They are now frequently striking high-value targets at depths of 120 kilometres behind the front line. Operationally, they have demonstrated some success in engaging Ukrainian vehicles that were recently moved to Kharkiv. Overall, the Kharkiv offensive is likely to be part of a broader effort to stress the entire line. It is unlikely to yield a decisive breakthrough, but will ease the pressure on Russian units fighting in other areas. Now, if this trajectory continues, it will become increasingly difficult for Ukraine to stabilise the front and prevent further territorial losses and casualties. Now, Russia has deployed precision strike assets with greater regularity and confidence. This is typically conducted with reconnaissance from a long-range drone that is closely integrated with missiles, such as Iskander, Tornado S, and occasionally air-launched missiles called D-30SM. This is called a reconnaissance strike contour in Russian military parlance, and it is clearly having a significant impact on Ukraine's air defences and command and control structures. It is coupled with more tactical elements, such as the widely covered use of guided glide bombs, laser-guided artillery, and the Lancet loitering munition. This shift seems to have occurred because Russia's reconnaissance drones are able to fly longer and farther as Ukraine lacks the air defence missiles to shoot them all down and close air support. To give an example, Russia's use of the Lancet loitering munition has expanded significantly in the last 3 months. There were 178 strikes in March, 140 in April, and 157 already this month. Many of these strikes will have disabled or have destroyed key Ukrainian systems like air defence platforms and artillery. Alongside this, Russian units are adapting to the use of the first-person vision drones in various ways. There are more electronic warfare systems for vehicle protection, and the turtle tank concept is proliferating, which indicates that it is a successful countermeasure. FPVs have also provided Ukraine with a powerful and cost-effective form of firepower until now, and has largely served to ameliorate the lack of artillery ammunition. However, if Russian units become more effective at countering them, Ukraine's lethality will decline significantly. Russian activity should be expected to peak around the G7 summit in June and the NATO meeting in July. So the government therefore has a window of opportunity to maximise its activity and help Ukraine. The UK has been the driving force in supporting Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion and before. The UK has stood shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people, delivering quite often over the initial objections of our allies the kit that the Ukrainian military needed most and when they needed it. The UK was the first to offer training, to provide NLAWs, to ship 155mm artillery shells, to provide tanks, and to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles. Ukraine must win this war. As has been said by others, failure to do so would result in severe consequences for NATO and the rest of the world. If Ukraine concedes 1 inch of land to Russia, then Putin and our other enemies in China and Iran would draw the inevitable conclusion that the West simply isn't up to the task or has the willpower to defend our freedom or protect our way of life. We have trained some 40,000 Ukrainian troops so far since this invasion began, in addition to a commitment to train Ukrainian jet pilots. But the question remains, how does Ukraine win this war? How does Ukraine fully expel Russian forces from their territory? Ukraine needs the right weapons to defend against Russian attacks, but also weapons to support their campaign to liberate their land. Now, throughout the war so far, Ukraine has used ammunition and artillery at an astonishing rate, approximately 6,000 artillery rounds per day on average over the course of the 2-year period. Now, to put this in perspective, Desert Storm in 1991, the ground war was concluded in just 4 days using 15,000 rounds per day. Now, Estonian analysts estimate that around 2.4 million shells will be needed for Ukraine to mount an effective counter-offensive against Russian forces or Russian-backed separatist forces such as those in Donetsk. The target of 2.4 million artillery shells is achievable eventually, but only with additional American support. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, the American capacity for manufacturing of 155mm HE artillery stands at 28,000 per month, and an anonymous American defence official said inventory of 155 military artillery shells has fallen to an uncomfortably low level. And as a consequence, there is a target to ramp up production to 100,000 per month by the end of the year. Now, a discussion paper published by the Estonian Ministry of Defence notes that 4,800 anti-air missiles are required on an annual basis. However, meeting this target would exceed all NATO production capacity at the current rate, with current American levels standing at 3,600 and the rest of NATO standing at 1,000 of these anti-air missiles. Ukrainians have been asking for Patriot missiles, and according to the Heritage Foundation, US Army stockpiles have stood at approximately 4,410 from 2005 until now, with a production capacity of 240 per year. However, with instances of Ukrainians firing 30 missiles in as many seconds and employing around 10% of annual global production last year, this makes clear that the production of air defence missiles has to be stepped up. Companies like MBDA in my constituency are a key part of this effort. The manufacturing of the Storm Shadow missiles will make a tangible difference on the battlefield. The long-range, conventionally armed, deep strike weapon is designed to be used in pre-planned attacks against high-value stationary targets with pinpoint accuracy. Now, these missiles are proven invaluable in targeting Russian positions in Crimea. The use of these munitions has been highly effective in containing the Russian onslaught. And I'm glad to see that our government agrees that Ukraine can use British weapons to strike any targets it deems necessary for its defence. I would like to see our allies in the US and others follow our lead in allowing the Ukrainians to use the long-range missiles the Americans and others have given against Russian targets in Russia itself. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, would be an absolute game-changer. This demonstrates that all our NATO allies should follow our example by putting their defence manufacturing on a war footing, especially when it comes to artillery and ammunition. Alliance members must meet NATO requirements, such as the requirement for all members to have a 30-day stockpile of wartime munitions, a requirement only half of members met prior to the invasion, and brought home by the fact that by November 2022, 20 NATO allies have significantly diminished their stockpiles. We should be in no doubt that Russia will remain a belligerent neighbour, even after they've been thrown out of Ukraine. NATO members, including the UK, will need to maintain war levels of reserves of equipment well into the medium term. We're also the first major ally to see a long-term defence security partnership with Ukraine. This alliance foresees helping Ukraine develop a sustainable defence industrial base while at the same time expanding and fortifying our own. Now, the UK has ring-fenced £350 million to forge collaboration and partnerships between UK and Ukrainian drone companies to marry technologies and scale up production to get thousands of drones to the front line within the next 6 months. Now, this type of practical cooperation is a win-win for both of our countries, an example to our allies. Both of our countries benefit from the sharing of technologies, the real-time battlefield testing of equipment, and with the further iteration of technological development and collaboration which will help defend this country. This form of practical collaboration should be expanded into other areas of defence manufacturing. And we must assist the Ukrainians to start producing their own equipment in country or as near as damn it. And we need to be clear, the money we spend in engaging in this type of cooperation is not aid. It is an investment into the United Kingdom's long-term defence and security. The defence of Ukraine today is the defence of the United Kingdom tomorrow. And I have heard first-hand, over and over, from senior members of the Ukrainian government of their frustration at the bureaucracy that is slowing down this cooperation. So I call upon our ministers to work even closer with their Ukrainian counterparts to identify and eliminate those obstructions. I have met representatives from Ukrainian SMEs, and even today, somebody told me that they want to talk directly to their British counterparts to develop technology together. So I want to see the MOD facilitating these conversations and not merely directing them to the big prime contractors. The Prime Minister said in this House on Monday the 15th of January, in response to a question from myself, that he agreed that we must place defence manufacturing on a wartime footing. We are now mid-May. This has to be accelerated, in my view. We do not have the luxury of time. This cannot be business as usual. We must work with our Ukrainian friends to build the arsenal of the free world together.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to be able to participate in this vital debate, a debate full of parliamentary unity, as colleagues have said. And I'm grateful because in the past 2 years, I've been able to meet Ukrainians who have come to the UK, forced from their home country. I was able to visit refugee camps in Poland in the early months of this war. And I've been able to work with MPs from Ukraine through the Interparliamentary Union on a regular basis at assemblies and elsewhere. And the UK government's and the UK's resolute and profound support for Ukraine is one of the few areas where this government has acted with consistency and with honour. And it is vital that the next government deepens and intensifies our relationship with Ukraine, as well as Poland, the Baltic and the Scandinavian states, who understand the scale of the threat and are ready to act decisively. And I want to welcome the 10-year agreement and the 100-year agreement with Ukraine, committing us to a covenant that will endure through time and begin to outline a post-Brexit foreign policy that will define us for the next century. This reaffirmation of our commitment to Ukraine comes at a critical time also. We must all face the credible possibility that the United States will scale back its support for Ukraine after the presidential election. And we can no longer expect Washington to take on the mantle of European security. It is therefore more important than ever that European states hold steadfast in their support for Ukraine. We must recognise that Russia is stronger now than it was at the beginning of this war. The UK's sanctions proved less effective than predicted. And Russia has succeeded in strengthening its relationship with China, in which there are, in their words, no limits. It is deepening its relationship with Iran, North Korea and India, through which Russian oil and gas makes its way onto the open market. Russian power grows stronger, not weaker, in Africa. And the news from Kharkiv indicates that the balance is shifting decisively on the battlefield. Russia's military capacity is intensifying as it shifts to a war economy, funded by its sale of precious metals and natural resources, overwhelmingly to China. So in doing so, it creates a Eurasian economic sphere
on which they can depend upon to access the raw materials necessary for their defence and industrial production. And so whilst we have tended to think about this war in terms of values, in terms of democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law, we have thought less about value, about how our relationship with Ukraine must be a productive partnership. Ukraine has the largest titanium, lithium, uranium, and graphite reserves in Europe. We must also understand this war as a battle over the raw materials required for modern defence and industrial production. Titanium is essential for aircraft, helicopter, and drone production. Lithium for the batteries that will fuel the vehicles of the future. If Russia is allowed to gain control of this critical resource endowment, the continent's security prospects will be in even greater jeopardy. We must prevent Russia seizing Ukraine's natural resources, and we must secure them for Ukraine. These are the materials required for the renewal of our common defence capability. The balance of power is shifting throughout the world. Globalisation has not delivered what it promised, a point made by my honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. The spread of democracy, human rights and the rule of law has been proven not to be inevitable. We can only defend these values if we are able to defend ourselves. Our alliance with Ukraine is part of that defence, and it must include the renewal of our collective industrial and defence capabilities. And we must ensure that it works because we are defending our liberty and sovereignty as well as theirs. And the foundation of our partnership with Ukraine must be one of enduring value as well as shared values. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think this House is at its best when we get serious issues of this kind and all sides of the House are in agreement, broad agreement, with what needs to be done. We've heard some excellent speeches this afternoon, informed speeches this afternoon from both sides, and I think the announcements made at the beginning of this debate by the Deputy Foreign Secretary are very welcome, particularly the £3 billion this country is going to give Ukraine this year and every year thereafter, and some of the significant sums on, for example, artillery and drones are very welcome. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've reached a critical point in the Ukraine-Russia war when we, along with our allies, need to decide how far and how long we can take our support. In recent weeks, Russian forces have made slow but important advances on Kharkiv area, Ukraine's second largest city, compounding their advances by stretching the Ukraine army along a wide front, opening up new fronts, as well as widening those in Southeast Asia in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, will stretch Ukrainian forces in a battle of resources as Ukraine awaits the delayed US aid and equipment. The UK and the US have provided strong support for Ukraine, but there have been limitation and critical delays, as others have said, in providing the weapons and equipment needed. We are at a point where this war is dragging on, with limited and slow advances on both sides. The West has provided enough support for Ukrainians to defend themselves, but not enough to make decisive advances, let alone enough to end the war. We must decide with our allies if we step up this support now to persuade the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine. What we should not do is allow a war in Europe to drag on many years and become a frozen conflict. This will cause an increased death toll, damage to Ukraine infrastructure, and an impact on our own and other Western economies. Not only will this continue to prolong the suffering of the long and brave Ukrainian people, it will make the job of rebuilding the country in the longer term much more difficult. There is a strong possibility that if we are not sufficiently determined to oppose Russia now, their aggression will not cease with Ukraine. We've only got to look at what's happening in Georgia at the moment. Whatever the rights and wrongs of that particular demonstrations are over the foreign agents law, it is clear that the majority of people in Georgia want a closer alignment with Europe and NATO over their historic ties with Russia. And this will be a cause for thought in Moscow. I use those words carefully. In Europe, the possibility of a Baltic state or Moldova also being at risk. What would it mean if a NATO state was targeted next? Estonia's Prime Minister has urged at the security conference held in Tallinn for NATO allies to follow their response in stepping up support for Ukraine. While in Moldova, they have recently defied Russia with an EU security pact deepening defence cooperation. And of course, one of the outcomes, whatever happens to the war in Ukraine, is that both Norway and Sweden have become members of NATO. Finland and Sweden have become members of NATO. It's deeply held, independent, non-aligned, neutral countries joining NATO must be a real slap in the face for the Russians. European countries have a huge vested interest in continuing to provide considerably more equipment and training. Some countries, as I've already mentioned, such as Germany and Poland, are to be commended for what they've done. As I've already said, the UK is sending an extra 500 million on top of the 2.5 billion in military aid it had already pledged to give Ukraine in 2024. In February, the EU agreed to further 42 billion package, but by March they had failed to meet targets on shells to Ukraine. After the US, Germany, UK is the third largest suppliers of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. And as I indicated in my intervention on the Deputy Foreign Secretary in his excellent speech, I think we must do much more on the diplomatic front to try and encourage a coalition of the willing. Because as my right honourable friend for Harwich and North Essex said, the consequences of the Russians winning in Ukraine are huge in the longer term, because it does mean, I think, that a number of non-aligned nations will then decide perhaps that they are better with the coalition of Russia and China rather than the West, and that would be an utter disaster. So it is important that we try to build that coalition of the winning, and it isn't just Europe and America that I was thinking of. I think there are countries in Southeast Asia, countries in the Middle East, that we should be trying to persuade to join in this coalition. And whilst, of course, the US have been a huge suppliers of arms and financial support, their contributions to the war have far outweighed what has been sent by all other countries put together. In a recent visit to Kiev, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, pledged ongoing US support for Ukraine after Congress had approved its $61 billion aid package. Arriving at the front line, as my right honourable friend for Bradley, Stoke and Filton has said, are the ATA-CMS long-range precision-guided missiles. Of the £61 billion worth of aid being provided, around $8 billion will be used to resupply with Ukraine with missiles and ammunition. A critical point. These missiles are absolutely critical. The US has also been stepping up its own arms manufacturing, as we heard on the PAC visit to the Pentagon 2 months ago. And that is absolutely critical. And I believe Europe needs to step up its arms manufacturing, which it's pledged to do, but it seems to be doing far too slowly. And it isn't, just as my honourable friend said, just the manufacturing. These shells require huge volumes of hardened shelters to put them in. So there's a lot attached to building up this capacity, but he was quite right to indicate the figures that he gave, and I think furthermore, after that first year, the second year, the step up will be even greater. So that is really good news. But as the Prime Minister said, we're facing some of the most dangerous and yet transformational years to come. Others have mentioned that the Ukrainians must be free to make the decisions on how they use the arms that we supplied. They should not be hampered by conditions imposed by us. It is an utter nonsense to watch the Russian troops massing on the border near Kharkiv and then expecting them not to use the vital weapons that we've supplied to prevent that happening. An important area that's not been discussed this afternoon, I think, is that any military tactician knows that to win a ground war needs air superiority. And therefore, if the West really wants to help Ukraine, it's got to be far more generous in providing fighter aircraft, complete with trained Ukrainian pilots and anti-aircraft missiles. The Ukraine has constantly asked the US for fighter jets to counter Russia's air superiority. In May 23, the US agreed to let other nations supply Ukraine with US-made F-16s. But the US has hundreds of these aircrafts, which are being rapidly superseded and could well afford to donate some of them. Instead, it said that the F-16s must be supplied by Denmark, Netherlands and other nations, and we must train those pilots in how to use them. As others have said, our missiles have been very effective at deterring Russian ships in the Black Sea. Now, I say to the SNP spokesman, who slightly, and I'm not really criticising, but he slightly dismissed the fact that grain was getting out of Ukraine. Not only is that good in itself, but what is really important, and others have touched on this, is that small businesses are actually able to flourish in Ukraine today, and it's really important that they are able to generate profits, and even more important, able to employ people who are not able to fight in the war, such as women who are not on the front. So this is really important that the Ukrainian economy is beginning to actually flourish again. I'd happily give way to him.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I don't disagree with the honourable gentleman at all. What I was very specific what I said. I talked about its tactical advantage, and that is minimal.
I entirely accept what the honourable gentleman has said. As Russian advances are being made in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin was making a state visit to China in a show of strength. China is the largest investor in Ukraine after Russia, and it is propping up the Russian economy, the ailing Russian economy, by buying a significant quantity of Russian oil and gas at cheap prices. And this, China could have a significant influence on Russia, settle the war if it chose to do so. I have to say that a group of colleagues visited China the other day and made these points, but I don't think we had any impact on the Chinese. Surprise, surprise, maybe some of you would say. But you have to go and you have to engage, otherwise you certainly won't have an impact. Putin has been making recent changes, dismissing his defence minister who had been in charge since 2022, the beginning of the war, when Putin expected Russia to take Kiev in days, replacing him with a very different person in Andrei Buloshkov, who is now overseeing the $117 billion defence spending that Russia has embarked on, building up a Russian war machine, reminiscent to what they did in World War II, turning their entire economy onto a war footing, suggesting that Putin is preparing for a long war with Europe. In addition, its allies, China, Iran, North Korea, have huge manufacturing capabilities who could replace a significant proportion of Russian arsenal if they wished. If it is the case that we and our allies are unwilling to provide more decisive support, there will inevitably be a political settlement between the two countries, which will leave Russia in a far more powerful position, as I indicated earlier. Of course, as my honourable friend for Harwich indicated, we don't know what the US position will be after the elections in November. And that is why I would say to my honourable friend on the front bench today, it is imperative that we engage with both sides in that election, both Republican and Democrats, so that whatever happens, we are making the point strongly that it is vital that the Americans continue on this course. Otherwise, there is a danger that we will not be able to win this war. Hotbeds of tension could unravel in the years to come in the Middle East and East Asia, around Taiwan and China, are being carefully managed at the moment. Eyes are on the West and how we deal with Russia. The more Russia succeeds in Ukraine, the more cooperation between Russia and China seems to be strengthening, and the old enmity between them is reducing. This is incredibly dangerous, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Urgent, concerted and positive help must be given to Ukrainian people in their hour of need for as long as it is needed to deter Russia from taking any further offensive action in the rest of Europe.
Marie Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. For over 2 years, Ukrainians have been fighting this war on behalf of all of us. The brave Ukrainians are fighting for our shared values. They are fighting for our democracy, for our freedom, and indeed Europe's freedom. Many of those brave Ukrainians have paid the ultimate sacrifice. Women and children have paid unspeakable suffering and death. We are not dying each day to defend Europe from Russia. Our job, and the job of other European and NATO countries, has been to support Ukraine. This has been through military aid, sanctions and cracking down on dirty money. Yet too often we are playing catch-up. The delays in vital support getting to Ukraine has cost them dearly. The delay in American support for months has given Putin a newfound optimism. The optimism could prove catastrophic to our Ukrainian allies. Who knows what will happen in the US president's election, yet our country and Europe needs to be ready. Our support for Ukraine needs to step up. Any sign of weakness or hesitancy inspires Putin. The results of this war will have a greater impact on Europe than it will on America. It is ultimately our war, Europe's war. We need to make sure that Ukraine wins. Yet when armaments are supplied, too often restrictions are placed upon them. Limiting the use of long-range missiles is asking Ukraine to defend their country with one arm tied behind their backs. Russia has gone on all in to win. Ukraine being able to fire missiles, fire miles slightly further will not change Russia already barrack behaviour. The massacre of Ukrainians in Bucha shows how the Russians will behave if they win. Ukrainians know they are fighting for their survival. There is $300 billion of Russian central bank funds sitting in the Euro-Clear exchange. Our government should be pressurising the EU to use it to support Ukraine. Money seized here should also be used to support Ukraine. China has given Putin a blank cheque. They are supplying him to win. It's also time for talks for Ukraine to join NATO and the EU to begin and to be hastened. That is what they are fighting for, to be part of the free and democratic world. Ideas that many have fought and died for. Denying them that in hope of appeasing a ruthless dictator is pointless. History teaches us that trying to appease a bully does not work. Ukraine is backed by the free and democratic world. Putin is backed by the dictators and the despots. If Putin wins, every authoritarian regime across the world will be emboldened. Whether we like it or not, there is war in Europe. There will be a winner and a loser. It is essential that Ukraine wins this war. We must ensure that Ukraine gets what it needs, and timely so, to win this war. Ukraine must win, for if not, Europe and NATO, I don't know, must do everything in their power. Ukraine must win, for if not, I really fear Europe and NATO may not survive in the future.
Sir Edward Leigh. Nothing I'm going to say in this short speech in any way approves of what President Putin has done. He is an appalling man, a tyrant, has caused massive damage, infrastructure, countless deaths. But we have to be realistic in these debates. We can't just will what we want. And there is a mismatch between our determination, our interest, our will, and that of the Russian state. I mean, let's go back in history. When people discuss Ukraine in the West, they often assume that this is a simple issue of a large state invading a small country which has always been independent. This is not the view of the Russian state or of most people who live in Russia. Ukraine means borderland, and for centuries since Catherine the Great, Ukraine was effectively part of Russia. Even under the Soviet Union, Crimea was part of the Russian Federation and was only willed to Ukraine by diktat in the 1950s. Not a single member of parliament objected to that. The Crimean people weren't consulted. Now, I'm not in any way defending the Russian position. What they've done is absolutely appalling. But from this historical reality, and it is a reality in terms of the Russian state, they are absolutely determined to pursue their objectives, as wrong as they may be. And as we've heard, Putin is a tyrant. He has put the entire Soviet Russian economy on a war footing. He is apportioning a part of the economy on defence, which we have not been spending since the Second World War. Although we may want to win this war, we have to be realistic that it's extremely unlikely, given the mismatch in resources between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine, and all the difficulties the Ukrainian state has been trying to cope with in terms of the management of its own economy for many years, corruption and many other issues. It is extremely unlikely, sadly, that Ukraine can win this war. As I said earlier, this war is following the pattern of earlier wars that Russia has engaged in. Early incompetence replaced by an utter determination to will and in completely impervious to the loss of human life. I will give way briefly.
For that then, and thank you for giving way. Does the honourable member not agree that if the battle in Ukraine is lost, then it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, West Germany, and eventually the whole way back to us? So the battle in Ukraine has to be won. It's not a matter of giving in, we have to win it.
Then, if we're going to win this war, we have to be prepared to give the resources necessary to do so. And the truth is that such is the overwhelming preponderance of the American industrial military estate that they could have won this war by now. America could have armed Ukraine to such an extent that it could have won. America could have allowed Ukrainians to use their weapons to bombard Russian forces within Russia. America does not want Ukraine to humiliate Russia and win this war. America does not want Ukraine to lose the war. America could have won this war by now, as it won the Second World War, but apparently it is not prepared to wield the resources. We may not agree with that, we may not like it, but that is a reality. We all know that such is the strength of the American economy that we all know what's happened. For months, weapon deliveries were delayed. Now, all I'm trying to do is inject a note of reality in this. We can't keep having these debates and saying we are determined to win this war, we must win the war, when we are not actually willing the resources. And therefore I ask the House, are we determined to put our own economy on a war footing? Are we determined to spend less on health and education and justice and all the other good things that we believe in order to win this war? Are we prepared to perhaps put our own troops into Ukraine? Are we prepared for our own young men to die? Or are we just prepared for thousands of young Ukrainian men to die when we're not prepared to have a single casualty ourselves? These are the realistic questions. So what is the most likely outcome of all this is that there will be horror, stalemate, and eventually somebody in Europe, as I said earlier, President Macron or that sort of statesman in Europe, will then say that we have to conduct peace negotiations. What do we do then? Are we going to be part of this movement to have peace negotiations? Are we going to reward Putin for his aggression? Are we going to accept that there is a stalemate and therefore Russia is enabled to grab part of Ukraine? What is our attitude? Nobody yet in this debate so far has seriously addressed these questions. All they've just said is that we will win this war, although deep down, look into your hearts. Is there actually anybody sitting in this chamber, I'm not saying what they say publicly, but what they think privately, does anybody sitting in this chamber actually think now that Ukraine is going to win this war? Yes. Now, well, you say, how? Given the huge mismatch in resources between Russia and Ukraine, given the fact that America apparently is not prepared to furnish Ukraine with sufficient armaments to ensure this, how are we going to win it? So, I'm with you all. I'm quite prepared to put our own economy on a war footing. I'm even prepared to send our own troops to Ukraine. I'm prepared to spend less on all the things that I value, like health and justice and all the rest of it. But we have to be realistic, and the moment we are not being realistic. And so, as a result of that, Europe is sort of trembling in a sort of arthritic way, neither pursuing the war with full vigour, which is what we did in the Second World War, which is how we won, nor prepared to conduct peace negotiations. And the result is a stalemate. And this is deeply damaging to our reputation, to our economy, to everything else. I just pose a question. I'm not saying we should give in, I'm not saying we should have peace negotiations, but I just want to ask the front benches to be realistic in this debate.
Well, thank you. I was going to make a speech, but I'm going to have to make a very different speech now after the last speech by the honourable member for Gainsborough. I think he's an outrider for his own party in his view. I mean, first of all, I want to take on this idea that Ukraine historically, is just some sort of outcropping of Russia. I'll start and go backwards, actually. So my father wrote his PhD on the Varangian, the Viking incursion to Slavic lands. The Varangians created the Kiev Rus, the Kiev Empire. It wasn't an empire based in Moscow, it was an empire based in Kiev. Kiev predates Moscow as the predominant city of the Slavic lands. And if anybody wants to make a claim, it probably should be the people in Stockholm, because they were Swedish Vikings who settled those lands and established that kingdom, although I don't think the Swedes have any such ambitions. If we move back even further to Crimea, the Scythians settled Crimea and created the agricultural breadbasket that we know today in southern Ukraine and Crimea, and supplied the Greek Empire with their grain. It was that established the Athens and other republics in Greece and fostered the democracy that we know now, because the Greeks could rely on the Scythians for grain. That is the ancient legacy of Ukraine. Not Moscow, not the Tsars, but the Scythians and then the Varangians. Now, so the Ukrainians have a very clear and historic right to a nation. That's what I want to say first of all. It's straight out of the Putin playbook to try and denounce the fact that they have a legitimate state. Secondly, and the point that I will agree with the honourable member about is that the UK, the United States and every European nation does need to go on a war production footing. That is what we need to do. We need to increase our production of basic military equipment, artillery shells, bullets. And the Minister out there has known how many times I've questioned him about this issue. And then more advanced military equipment as well. Actually, the most advanced drone manufacturer in the world now, an anti-drone manufacturer in the world now, is Ukraine. And we've got much to learn from them and many things we can do in joint ventures for our own defence and future. But we need to ramp up our own military production. We have underutilised factories. We have underutilised factories in the US. They have promised to up their production by the end of the year. And in Europe, and to be fair to the Germans, they have done exactly that, particularly in shell production. It's estimated that the Russians are expending 10 to 15,000 artillery shells a day, At the beginning of the war, that figure was over 50,000. So they themselves have depleted their reserves and are just using their current production. It is inconceivable that 30 or so countries in Europe, North America, cannot match that level of production if we went on a war production footing. Now, I wasn't intending to talk actually so much about military production. I was intending to talk because it's been my honour to be the co-chair of the Ukraine APBG since December 2022. And in that time, I've organised 3 humanitarian aid convoys to Ukraine and 3 parliamentary delegations to Ukraine. I can see people in the room that have come on those. And the people of Ukraine owe us nothing, but we owe the people of Ukraine everything. The sacrifices I've seen, the towns and villages I've seen destroyed, the schools obliterated, I've seen men without legs, without arms, who are still wanting to contribute to the war effort of their country. We cannot abandon those people. They have not asked for this situation, and it's been meted upon them by a violent, brutal autocrat. I won't call him a dictator, I'm not sure we're quite there yet. But the last Russian presidential election was not legitimate. It was a stolen election. And we are now in a situation where and I agree with him, I think we are a bit weak-minded. And Putin's mind is like a ball of steel. And he will stop at nothing. And we need to take that same attitude, that we will stop at nothing. He will only back down if he sees strength. He will not back down on weakness. And it's not just a United Kingdom issue, it's an issue, as I said, for the whole of Europe and North America and the rest of the democratic world. And we need to ensure that we are doing everything. And I just want to make a few points, because I'm going to finish shortly, because I know others want to speak. In terms of humanitarian aid, it is still not that easy for humanitarian aid to flow across the UK border and into Ukraine across EU borders. We're still seeing issues of people from Ukraine who want to travel here gaining visas. It's not acceptable that people have to travel to Warsaw to get a visa. We need consular services. If you can't provide them in Kyiv, provide them in Lviv. It's also, we also need to look at how the funding that we've raised for humanitarian has been spent. A very large proportion of the money raised by DEC, by the goodness of the British people, has been spent outside of Ukraine and other countries because it's been deemed too difficult to spend inside Ukraine. But there are small aid charities like the ones we've been working with who are willing and able to spend money in Ukraine but have no supply of funding. We need to open up the books of all the charities. DEC only will open up the books, the money it's collected through DEC, not each individual organisation. We need to see more money being spent within Ukraine. We have 300 billion euros sat in Euroclear, and we need to see that money not just frozen, but seized and then be utilised for that war effort, and then we'll see a change in the front. And actually, the biggest difference that can be made to see a swift conclusion of war and no more Russian troops on Ukrainian territory is air superiority. The Ukrainians are losing the war because they cannot defend their troops on the ground because the Russians have air superiority. We've done a good job in training the first tranche of pilots from Ukraine, and now other countries are also training, but they need the planes. They need the planes now. We had a setback in the election in Slovakia where we were about to see planes go and then they subsequently haven't. We need other countries, but particularly the United States, supply F-16s. And we need both variants of the Storm Shadow missile made in the UK to go to Ukraine, not just the export variant, as the Honourable Member for Filton Bradley Stoke very expertly spoke about earlier. And I think that, finally, that we need to have the resolve and the long-term commitment to support Ukraine and not just see this as something that happened 2 years ago that is slowly sliding off the agenda.
Richard Foord.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member for Leeds North West, the chair of the Ukraine APBG. But I'd also like to say that it was interesting that the Right Honourable Member for Gainsborough brought some dissent into the room, into the chamber, because sometimes the consensus that exists actually can stop us thinking freely and thinking of alternatives, and sometimes it is helpful to have a sort of almost devil's advocate approach that he brought in. I mean, to the point that he made about the stalemate as he observes it, I think we need to think not about the situation on the ground entirely, but actually about what makes us different, what makes Ukraine different from Russia. And what I think we've seen in Ukraine from Russia is chauvinism. We've seen the sorts of chauvinism, this term sort of understood more broadly, that there is a tendency in the Russian mind to regard itself as superior, as nationalist, as imperialist. What we're seeing in Ukraine is Russian chauvinism. And it's that, for me, which means we cannot simply talk about an accommodation at this stage. Diplomacy? Yes, of course. Diplomacy must go on as the war goes on, because, of course, the war is but politics by other means. But we need to be negotiating. Ukraine, indeed, needs to be negotiating from a position of strength, and certainly from a position where it is stronger than the one that it sees itself in now. The Deputy Foreign Secretary started his speech today talking about the £3 billion that the government has announced for Ukraine as annual military aid, and he asked the question, will other political parties support it? And the answer is yes, absolutely. The Liberal Democrats, as other parties have already set out this afternoon, certainly intend to support £3 billion annually for Ukraine. And I do hope that support for Ukraine does not serve to be a party political issue in the run-up to a general election. Let's look at things differently, but let's have a consensus as we have up to now. The UK has been pretty exceptional in Europe for having a consensus across our political parties, and let's hope that may continue. The Liberal Democrats develop our policy at conference. It's very democratic. It's voted on by our members. And last autumn, we hosted Kira Rudik, the leader of Ukraine's Liberal Party, Holos. And she gave a very emotional speech from the platform that resulted in the sort of standing ovation that was both instinctive and heartfelt. And I think that explains why, in my party, but I know other parties today, there is this real determination to stand with Ukraine until the end. But I think it is also necessary to think about end games, end points, how the war might end, and so I will address that in my closing remarks. I would like to actually talk about how the war in Afghanistan ended for the Soviet Union. I'd like to think about also how this war might end, given the amount that Russia is spending at the moment on defence, and think finally about what role China might play in any conclusion to this war. In 1988, the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, and it did so after 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. And a lot of people attribute to the withdrawal the fact that back home in the Soviet Union, many families were mourning the loss of their soldiers, and there was this sort of pressure on the government in Moscow to withdraw from Afghanistan. Now, we're plainly not going to see that sort of situation here. In Afghanistan, the motivation was about communist ideology and about economic models. This is much more a war for Russia of religion, of culture, and of spiritual questions. The amount of money that the Soviet Union was expending on that war was huge, and in the end, we can think how post-1989, we saw the breakup of the Soviet Union because of the amount of money it had spent on that war and on seeking to keep up with the expenditure of the United States and NATO. But we should certainly give some thought to the popular support for the war in Russia, because we know that Russians are following their propaganda pretty closely. There's an independent polling organisation that I've started to look at called the Levada Centre, and it asks the question, who initiated the aggression in eastern Ukraine? 48% of Russians are said to think that it was the United States and NATO, 20%, only 20% that it was initiated by Kyiv, 14% that it's difficult to say, and 4% Russia. And you might suppose that this is this is a brutal authoritarian regime where people are scared to give their opinions. I accept that, but I do also think that Russians fed daily on this propaganda about the expansion of NATO and of this sort of eastward expansion that they think about when they think about the Second World War. It's very much in their minds. And we should try and get in their minds. Sun Tzu said many centuries ago, know your enemy. I've started to listen to Ukrainecast, BBC Ukrainecast podcast, and there was a fascinating interview on the 7th of May of Alexander Gensharov, a former Russian military officer, who when asked about why this war started, talked about how Ukraine had been prohibiting the Russian language, had been bombarding civilians in Kursk, in Bryansk, in Belgorod, and in Crimea. This is the mindset of Russians who support this war, and I think we should pay very careful attention to that, particularly as we are thinking about those restrictions that are imposed on Ukraine for the use of British weapons and how they might be used over the border into Russia. Finally, I just want to talk, when I'm thinking about how this war might end, about China. We saw last week Putin visiting Beijing, and I did suppose at the outset of this war that the war might end after the intervention of Chinese diplomacy. Actually, instead, what we saw was a sham of a peace plan from Beijing last March, in March 2023, where on the positive side, they did encourage Russia to stop nuclear saber rattling, but unfortunately is talking about the condemnation of unilateral sanctions and criticising the expansion of collective defence treaties, a euphemism for NATO. So while I still think that Chinese diplomacy could be helpful to us in bringing this war to an end, it won't be on those terms suggested by Beijing last year. In conclusion, I think we have talked a lot today about putting the UK economy on a war footing. We should think more about how we encourage our allies in Europe and beyond, including some of the neutral states who've yet to show skin in this game, that this war is a war of liberty and it's a war against chauvinism. Thank you.
Yeah. Kevan Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all begin by echoing, I think, the sentiments from across the House today for those supporting the fight in Ukraine against the unjust and illegal attack on that sovereign nation by Russia. I also pay tribute to the work of our NATO allies in terms of the support in which they're giving to the people of Ukraine, and above all to the tenacity and dedication of the people of Ukraine in resisting this totally unjust invasion. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've got to remember this is not the first invasion of Ukraine. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and then was engaged in a proxy war for nearly 8 years in the Donbass to try and weaken the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, this is quite clearly a war of choice by Vladimir Putin in terms of his invasion. And we can have all the excuses under the sun, reason why he undertook this reckless action. What I've very sadly heard from the Honourable Member for Gainsborough was basically straight out of the Putin playbook. My honourable friend for Leeds North West eloquently, I think, spelt out the truth around not only the ancient history around the integrity of Ukraine as a nation, but also debunked the nonsense, this Moscow-centric view that it has a right to dominate and dictate what goes in and around its borders. But if the honourable gentleman wants to be brought a little bit further up to date, not ancient history as very eloquently portrayed by my honourable friend for Leeds North West, but when the Soviet Union was disbanded, Ukraine had a third of the Soviet arsenal of nuclear weapons. It declared itself a state in 1990, and under the by joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed the Lisbon Pact in 1992 and gave up those nuclear weapons. And ourselves, along the United States and Russia, in the Bucharest Memorandum of the Security Assurance of 1994, guaranteed the integrity of the borders of Ukraine. So the idea that the present Russian leadership can get into some type of semantics about, well, this has always been part of Russia, where it's quite clearly not. But they actually gave an assurance in 1994 that Ukraine was an independent nation. I would ask people to just read the history rather than listen to some of the podcasts. And if there's one good thing, that it demonstrates, is how effective the propaganda machine of Russia has been. And we saw that certainly in the invasion in 2014 of Crimea, when suddenly even people should know better in national newspapers in this country were writing that Crimea had always been part of Russia, for example. So I would just ask people not to fall for this propaganda. Now, can Ukraine resist? Yes, it can. It has done a fantastic and I think valiant fight so far, but can only do that with the assistance of ourselves and our allies. Russia's lost some 450,000 personnel, either killed or wounded, since 2022. Ukraine liberated Kherson in November 22, but we have seen the continued pressure and the lengths to which Russia will go to put itself on a war footing has been argued, and also to ensure that it keeps trying chipping away at territory, but it is doing it at a huge cost to itself. And it's got to be part of our strategy, not just in terms of supplying weapons. We have got to crack down in terms of sanctions, people who are breaking sanctions. And you only have to look and it's not just in this country, but it's also part of Europe as well. A number of goods that are now being shipped to China, Turkey, Azerbaijan and other countries, who clearly that is not the end destination for many of those goods. They're going into Russia itself and helping the war machine as been outlined. And it's only because if we can have that collective will that we will actually succeed in resisting this aggression. Now, I'm one of the vice presidents of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and we've been united on the Assembly in terms of our support for Ukraine since 2022, not just in terms of all national delegations, but also individual members of Parliament make up the actual NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We first agreed an arrangement with Ukraine but as far back as 1991, and we have the Ukraine-NATO Interparliamentary Council, which has met on a number of occasions now, and will meet again this weekend at our meeting in Sofia in Bulgaria. But we are, I think, united in terms of the unanimous support, not only for Ukraine's military fight, but also in terms of defending its democracy and the humanitarian help which it will do. And again, as I said, this weekend we will pass another unanimous resolution in terms of support of Ukraine. And I say to those people who say, what happens if we fail in Ukraine, is I would suggest you talk to our colleagues, fellow parliamentarians in the Baltic states or Poland or Eastern Europe, former Eastern Europe, because they are fearful that if Russia gets its own way in Ukraine, they will be next. I had the honour of visiting the three Baltic states last year, and each one of them are conscious that they are a heartbeat away from being their democracy being snuffed out in terms of a Russian invasion. So it's important that we do contribute towards them. Now, in terms of the United Kingdom, and I do agree with the Deputy Foreign Secretary that I think there has been cross-party support in this House, which I think is very important in terms of sending a clear message, not just to the Ukrainians that we are supporting them, but also to be very clear to Russia and others that we will stand firm against this type of aggression. I have been a little bit concerned, though, I've got to say, since we've got the new Defence Secretary who's now trying to play politics with this, which I think is a bit sad, because when he challenged my honourable friend, who's a shadow Defence Secretary a few weeks ago, would he commit after the election to continue to support? I'm saying he should just grow up and stop playing politics with this issue. It's far too important to do that. Likewise, can I say, in terms of the political football which is being kicked around in terms of the 75 billion increase in defence expenditure, well, no, let's just be very clear. And I've been very clear in the 23 years I've been in this House, is that we do need more defence expenditure, not just for the sake of more defence expenditure, but we need it at this important time to ensure that we work with our NATO allies to not only help them, but actually resist and act as a deterrent. Because people say, well, if you support more defence, does that mean you're a warmonger? No, it doesn't. It's actually, I work on the very clear principle that, like nuclear deterrents, conventional deterrents are as important as well. And we need to keep arguing that, especially as someone was saying earlier on about in terms of, what happens if we get a new American president next year? Well, no, I'll be arguing still. I think we should continue arguing still for the importance of the transatlantic European alliance, because it may be a long way away, Ukraine, from the United States, but the United States have found before that if it doesn't actually act earlier, the cost in human life and cost to that country is certainly 10 times, if not more than that, if we have to defend it in terms of a hot war. So it is important that we actually work closely with our NATO allies and our European allies as well, because I do see people pointing fingers around Europe, saying this country's not doing that and that country's not doing that. Well, I've got to say, just look at what Europe as a whole is actually providing for Ukraine. I think it is a huge contribution. It's certainly on par with what the United States is given. And it isn't going to be important that we don't in any way get a disruption to the flow of both military equipment but also humanitarian aid as well, because that is going to be very important. Is it a fight for the rules-based order? Yes, it is, Mr. Deputy. I've no doubt about that. If Putin gets his own way in Ukraine, this will be not just a green light to others in terms of who want to use force to inflict their will on the world. But we are coming up to June the 6th, which is the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Those people died on those beaches to preserve the democracy that we all hold very dear. We sometimes take it for granted. I think what's happened in Ukraine has put into clear focus that democracy and freedom of speech, which we value, is very delicate, but it's certainly worth defending.
Jim Shannon. Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I say I'm very, very pleased to speak in this debate today and to add my support to those who have made very constructive contributions. And I wish to thank all of the members for their contributions and their so far. with everything that is going on in the world, it can be easy sometimes to forget about the devastation that's ongoing in Ukraine because you're not there, you don't see it every day, but we do see it in the news. And I think I'd have to start by saluting the courage, the tenacity and the strength of character of Ukrainian men, women and children. I remember when the war started, the one thing that impressed me greatly, Mr Deputy Speaker, was this. I remember whenever the schools were going, the schools and the canteen, the women in the canteen, they were making meals for the troops at the front. Those who were involved in making clothes and the wedding dresses, whatever it may be, they were making uniforms for the soldiers. It showed me a courage and a commitment from the whole nation together, men, women and children, who were saying to themselves, this war is our war. And every one of us, and they were committed in their entirety to support their troops at the front. And I remember saying to some people in the house here, I remember I said, if only we in this country had the same commitment, understanding of the war, what we could do as well. But our government and our ministers have very clearly showed that their commitment. So with that in mind, I congratulate them. I asked the Minister just last week an urgent question in relation to Russia's aggression relating to Ukraine, and also an update on the situation in Georgia. The Minister reinforced that the commitment from the government has. It's been some 815 days now since Putin's operation, and still Ukraine is subject to aggressive military operations. So it's important. We do need to do more to combat and assist this. The Honourable Member for Gainsborough, who's not here anymore, he asked the question, who believes that Ukraine can win? Well, I'll tell you what, Mr Dunn, I believe they can win. And I have to say that everyone on this side of the House believes they can win. And there's some people over there who believe they can win. There might be one or two who are doubters, who aren't sure about the future, who perhaps they would be, I say it with great respect to the Honourable Gentleman because he's a friend of mine, but Chamberlain lives on in this House with some people, and thank goodness that that particular individual opinion is one that is singularly held and not held by everyone else. What a blessing that is. I also speak up about the human rights and religious persecution that there's been in Ukraine, in the eastern Donbass region, where I know I'm a Baptist member of the church, a Baptist church member. Many Baptist pastors have went missing in the east of Ukraine whenever Russia came in. They've never been heard of, never been accounted, and their families grieve for their loved ones. So I ask the question again, where is the justice in what they do? The ongoing Russian threat has completely undermined human rights and democracy in Ukraine, and furthermore in Georgia too. Only last week, Russia launched a new offensive in the Kharkiv region, and our support to Ukraine to combat this has been monumental, and it is so important we continue to support in the future too. Whether it be missiles, whether it be the air defence systems, or whether it be ammunition, I think what we need to be doing, and I think Ukraine has asked that, they need the self-defence dome-type measures to combat the missile attacks from Russia. But their supplies must be of central attention to hold up Ukraine in their plight against Russia. Why do I believe, and why do others on this side of the House and some others across the way as well, believe that Ukraine can win? Well, just this week, or last week, the British Army were in manoeuvres, and they were shown by their strength in NATO what they could do. And if you add all the combination of all those NATO countries, of their military members, of their military might, it far outweighs what Russia has. So don't for one second think that we can't, as a Western countries, as a NATO, a member of the NATO country, don't think that we can combat, we can beat, we can not equal, we can beat what Russia has, and I believe that in my heart. And Poland has just announced that they're going to build a wall, and it's a defensive wall, it's a defensive barrier right down on their border against Russia. It shows the determination. that Poland has. It shows that Poland has the understanding of where the threat is. And if you add all this combination of all these countries, all these NATO countries, and that includes the contribution of the United States as well, yeah, they were slow to give the military aid that was needed and was some year and a half or thereabouts waiting on it to come through. But it's through now. The commitment is there. And when you add all that together, it can't be ignored. The strength of NATO is in the nations who are involved. It's in their military, it's in their outgoing military activity and their ability to combat Russia as best they can. Mr. Deputy Speaker, only yesterday it was revealed that Russia had been using an increasing amount of glide bombs, which are cheap but highly destructive. More than 200 of them are thought to have been used in a week to attack Ukraine's northern town of Lugansk. Further to this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 3,000 of these bombs were dropped in Ukraine in the month of March alone. It has also been said that Ukraine is struggling to combat these bombs. So it's imperative that we step in, and I know our ministers do, and our government does, and never criticise our government for their commitment. It has been incredible, and the support for this chamber on all sides, all parties, has made that easy. We need to ensure that Ukraine has the ammunition and defence needed to fight back. I'm always minded as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of Russia's army. They're an army of monsters. They're an army of criminals. They've carried out abuse, sexual rapes, attacks against women, girls as young as 8, men, women as old as 80. And they do that with a violence and a brutality. And there's a day coming, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you and I, and many in this House, believe that there'll be a day of reckoning one day whenever we pass this scene in time. There will be. But I'd like to see Russia and all those who have carried out these despicable crimes being made accountable and amenable in this world and right now. So when it comes to accountability, the violence they've carried out against some of the Ukrainian soldiers as well has been terrible. Some of the things they've done are quite unprintable. The Honourable Member for North Durham referred to, and I said it in an intervention, the importance of why we need to beat Russia, why it's important to focus on the positivity of beating Russia, because if it's Ukraine today, it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, West Germany, and us the next day. And that's why failure isn't in our psyche. It's about defeating Russia, and we have to be quite clear on what we're trying to achieve. I want to mention, if I can, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the issue of children. In May of this year, the UN Children's Fund reported that nearly 2,000 children in Ukraine have been killed or injured amidst ongoing and escalating war. However, the overall tally of children's deaths is likely to be higher due to displacement and deaths that have not been recorded. And the Honourable gentleman for the Shadow Minister who introduced his contribution referred to some of the children who were displaced and they were told that Ukraine, the battle was over, and they've been taken away from their families and their parents. The report comes after Russia escalated its attacks in the Kharkiv region, where several children were killed and hundreds of thousands of pounds of infrastructure were ruined and destroyed. In addition to this, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Speaker, according to Save the Children, 2.9 million children in Ukraine are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. The 2 years of the war have had a devastating toll on the people of Ukraine, with over 10,000 civilians being killed since the start of the war. And again, I must emphasise that the real numbers are likely to be much higher and will continue to rise. Furthermore, nearly half of the children enrolled in school in Ukraine are missing out on in-person schooling. So I know it's not the Minister's responsibility in education, but I do think we need to focus upon not just the military aid, but the education aid for our children and the humanitarian aid as well. Again, our government and our Minister have not been found wanting in relation to that. Almost 1 million children across the country are not able to access in-person learning opportunities due to insecurity. In 2023 alone, UNICEF is said to have helped 1.3 million children with formal and informal learning opportunities, which is fantastic. But it is so important that not only do we send support to Ukraine in terms of our military, but also in terms of providing assistance for children and their education, as there will be so many months of not learning which will need to be replaced. To conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, the UK has been a good friend, has been an excellent friend to Ukraine and Georgia and other countries threatened by Russia. And we will always call for resolutions on all sides. And our deep-standing partnership and support provided to Ukraine has been unwavering. In the interest of freedom, of liberty, of democracy, of justice, of decency, and they stand by one of our partners when they need help. More needs to be done to sustain a sovereign and democratic partnership. So I look to the Minister and to my government today to provide an update on our ongoing assistance. And perhaps, Minister, the Minister can tell us what assessment his department has made and how the war is impacting on young people's educations in Ukraine. Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you so much.
Opposition front bench. John Healy.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome this debate and say to the Government front bench, thank you for making time for this debate. The Shadow Foreign Secretary and I both wanted to do this debate together rather than delegate it to others to underline the importance we attach to the UK support for Ukraine. It also gives us the opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, as my right honourable friend did, to draw some lessons from the visit we made together last week to Ukraine. And I, like my right honourable friend, thank the Foreign Secretary for his help in facilitating that visit. If the Deputy Foreign Secretary would pass that on, we'd be very grateful. While we were there, Mr Deputy Speaker, in Erpine, we met 3 teenagers. We talked about their families, we talked about their friends, we talked about possible careers, their hopes for the future, but these young people had been through something so horrific that it belongs in the 1940s. After Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, these young people were kidnapped and they were sent to camps in Crimea and in Russia. Every morning they had to sing the Russian national anthem. They were sent to isolation if they didn't do what they were told. One, despite being a diabetic, was refused insulin and became very sick. Those running those Russian camps told these Ukrainian children, no one cares about you, your families are dead, Ukraine no longer exists. So first, I want to praise the work of the Ukrainian charity Save Ukraine. They are doing vital work to rescue such stolen children, to reunite them with their families, and to help those survivors deal with their trauma. And despite being told Ukraine no longer exists, more than 800 days on from Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it is still standing, it is still fighting, and they're fighting with huge courage, civilians and military alike. Yeah. We toured one factory. We spoke with the wives, the mothers, the fathers, all of whom had fled from the east in the face of Putin's invasion to Kyiv, all working now together to support the Ukrainian war effort. And whilever their loved ones are on the front line, everyone in Ukraine is fighting to defeat Putin. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Foreign Secretary and I had one simple message on our visit, and that is the UK continues to be united for Ukraine. If there is a change of government after the election this year, there will be no change in Britain's resolve to stand with Ukraine, confront Russian aggression and to pursue Putin for his war crimes. And we told the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Chief of Staff to President Zelensky, the parliamentarians we met, this is our Labour guarantee to Ukraine. And that's why we've fully backed the government's increased military aid to Ukraine this year and for the years ahead. Now, the Deputy Foreign Secretary said of my right honourable friend's Shadow Foreign Secretary's speech, he said he showed the unity of the House in this speech. He was right, and all the speeches tonight have showed the unity of this House. And in fact, this House has shown a unity behind Ukraine beyond the debates in this chamber. So, my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff North, the honourable member for Tor Bay, have all, as UK parliamentarians, been involved in gathering aid and driving that aid to Ukraine over the last couple of years. Other members have taken in Ukrainian families, and like tens of thousands of big-hearted Britain, we've offered in this country, through the Homes for Ukraine programme, shelter, refuge, a life in this country for over 140,000 Ukrainians fleeing Putin's invasion. I'll turn, if I may, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to some of the, in fact, to all of the contributions in the debate, but start with the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Harwich and North Essex. Characteristically, a deeply reflective speech with a wide sweep that recognised, as he said, this war is part of a global conflict. He quoted Secretary of State Blinken, who he quite rightly said was in Kyiv on the second day that we were there, in fact, on May the 15th. He quoted him saying, Ukraine is to make decisions for itself about how it's going to conduct this war. And in fact, I think the rest of what Blinken said is important. So Ukraine has to make decisions for itself about how it's going to conduct this war, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said. A war it's conducting in defence of its freedom, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and we will continue to back Ukraine with the equipment it needs to succeed. The Honourable Member for Angus, who speaks for the SNP from the front bench, added the SNP's voice to the all-party consensus. Well, I was puzzled when he described himself as an impartial observer of the UK's activities in Ukraine. However, he was dead right when he said, look, it's essential for Western European security that Putin's full-scale invasion fails. If he prevails, he will be tearing up the rules-based system. And that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is why it matters so much to us, as well as to the Ukrainians, that they win. The Honourable Member for Filton and Bradley Stoke, he's got so many innovative defence companies in his areas that he speaks actually as someone with quite a lot of technical expertise, but he was describing how, and with what kit, the Russians are stepping up their rate of successful fire on the front line. Defence of Ukraine today is defence of the UK tomorrow, he said. I liked that argument. It's an argument that I put in different terms consistently, which is that the UK's defence starts in Ukraine. And I think we need to do more on all sides of this House to convey that message, that sense of importance and urgency to the British public in order that we can help reinforce their continuing support for the war. My honourable friend, the member for Liverpool, Walton, characteristically, he made an argument as well as making a speech, which I always like to hear. He said, we think about this war in terms of values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy. He said, but we think about it less than we should about value, making the long-term partnership with Ukraine, if you like, valuable to the UK. And this seems to me especially important as a successful Ukraine will become, in partnership with the democratic West, central to wider European security and prosperity in the future. Now, the Honourable Member for, Right Honourable Member for the Cotswolds, quite rightly urged, as I will in my remarks in a little while, more attention and more effort on the diplomatic front to build what he called the coalition of the willing, and he pointed the attention of his own government and the House to consider countries that he said were in Southeast Asia, countries in the Middle East that should be part of his coalition for the willing. And he also warned, like the Honourable Member for Harwich and North Essex, about the increasing cooperation between China and Russia. Now, my honourable friend, the member for St Helens, South and Whiston, she reinforced the argument my right honourable friend was making in his speech, which is that we in the UK are still too often playing catch-up on sanctions and on tackling the dirty money of Russian oligarchs in our country. She urged the government to demonstrate more action and greater leadership in directing frozen state Russian assets towards the much-needed reconstruction help that Ukraine needs. The Honourable Member for Gainsborough said he wanted to inject some realism into the debate. Well, he was right. He was right to say, look, we can't just will what we want, and if what we want is a Ukrainian victory, we must will the resources, he said. But I just say to him, the Ukrainians can cope with what he described as the mismatch with Russia, as long as we and other nations maintain our backing for them. And that was a point picked up immediately by my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West. He said the importance of us ramping up our production is that if we and other allies of Ukraine do so with ammunition and weaponry, then Europe and the US between us can easily counter the levels of increased Russian production. And he showed a really extraordinary grasp of the history of Ukraine and the reality of Ukrainian history rather than the Russian revisionism that we sometimes hear. And I pay tribute to his work and the other officers of the all-party parliamentary group on Ukraine in both houses. The Honourable Member for Tiverton, and I will give way.
Wouldn't it also be sensible to emphasise that if we want this war to go on forever, then it would be to allow Russia to stay in control of sovereign Ukraine and territory. If we want a clean and clear end to this conflict, the only way to end the conflict is to expel Russia from illegally occupied territory.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to come on to some of the military challenges faced by Ukraine in a moment, if I may. But he made that point very powerfully in his speech earlier on. The member for Tiverton and Honiton, he echoed what we've declared as our Labour intent, which is to try and take the politics out of the UK's support for Ukraine in the run-up to the election. And I trust that the government will respond in the same way. And like the member for the Cotswolds, the honourable member for Tiverton and Honiton said that, look, more diplomacy with other countries who he described as yet to declare their position is required alongside the military aid that UK is supplying. My right honourable friend, the member for North Durham, I think he was the only one that reminded the House that in fact the Ukrainians haven't just been fighting Russia since February 2022. They've been fighting them for over 8 years before that, after the proxy forces invaded parts of the Donbass and Russia seized Crimea. And one of the things that both my right honourable friend and I have found most moving about both visits we've made to Ukraine is the wall of remembrance for fallen heroes that has the photographs and the details of all those before February 22. Over 13,000 Ukrainians who'd lost their lives fighting the Russians on Ukrainian soil. My right honourable friend also said that in his role as part of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, he reminded us that the Parliamentary Council there at NATO has established relations with Ukraine way back since 1991. What happens if we fail in Ukraine, he said. Well, he was right to say the Baltic countries, the former Eastern Bloc countries, all know that they will be next. And finally, the honourable member for Strangford reminded us all about the pattern of military aggression from Russia, not just in Ukraine, but also in Georgia. It's exactly what the UN Charter is designed to prevent. Big nations redrawing international boundaries by force. It's exactly why it's so important that Putin does not prevail. And when we were in Kyiv, Mr. Deputy Speaker, last week, the message of those we met was consistent. They described Ukraine and the conflict as at a critical moment. New offensives around Kharkiv, new attacks along the length of the front line. And that's an easy thing to say, but the length of the front line for the Ukrainians is 800 miles. That's as far as London to Aberdeen and back. The scale of the challenge they face is huge. And it is tough for Ukraine at the moment. It's set to get tougher still in the months ahead. And their most urgent and complex challenge is to stabilise the front in the coming weeks and prevent what are local tactical gains by Russia becoming a wider operational success. And stabilising the front depends on the prompt delivery from the west of air defence, of artillery and long-range strike systems. And it also depends not just on the Western allies but on the Ukrainians as well to construct effective defensive fortifications, to boost their own military manpower, to maintain the quality advantage they have in training their forces, and also to restore morale. But alongside this, the Ukrainians have also scored significant successes with their own offensive operations, and we must not lose sight of that, particularly outside the land war. Long-range strikes with indigenously produced weapon systems, partisan warfare in parts of Russia and the occupied territories, special forces operations and also their maritime operations. These are no longer symbolic, but increasingly substantial in their effect. So they have destroyed 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet. They have opened up, notwithstanding Putin walking away from the Black Sea grain initiative, they have opened up freedom of navigation in the western side of the Black Sea and are exporting more grain than they did under the initiative when Putin gave it the go-ahead, and they're exporting also many of their other exports as well. For the large majority of Ukrainians, it's quite clear that the stakes are nothing less than the survival of the state and the nation. They told us in Kyiv, Mr. Deputy Speaker, even if the West stops supporting us, we will not give up fighting. And this, I think, has also become a war about the survival of Russia as a state and the survival of its elites. Too often, I think, the Western view has been that somehow this is a war of choice for Russia, but that, I think, has underplayed how Russia has once again become a country whose primary vocation is war. Now, Mr. Speaker, Putin, in that vein, has now moved his industry, as several speakers have said, onto a wartime footing. He is now spending a total of 40% of his government budget on defence. This war is not only military, but it's also diplomatic and economic. And Putin will not make peace if he thinks he can win on the battlefield. He will not stop at Ukraine if he succeeds there. Our recent military aid packages from the UK and allies have been really warmly welcomed and received in Kyiv, but more is needed. Deliveries need to be sped up: air defence, ammunition, long-range missiles. And further diplomatic and economic action must be taken to isolate Putin further. We have to be able to show him that things will get worse, not better, for Russia. So this is why we're asking ministers and allies to take 3 immediate steps. First, deliveries of military support need to speed up and reach the front line. As the NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg has said, any country that can send more should send more. And training for Ukrainian troops should be expanded. Second, UK diplomacy should be accelerated leading up to the G7, the NATO 75th anniversary, the European Political Community meeting and Ukraine's Peace Summit, all taking place in the next few weeks. The purpose being to strengthen support for Ukraine, seize frozen Russian state assets, close sanction loopholes, all must be outcomes of successful summits over the next few weeks. And third, I'll give way on that.
In my contribution, I'd mentioned about the humanitarian aid the necessity to help civilians, because if you help the civilians, you also encourage the soldiers at the front. Does the honourable gentleman believe that there needs to be a focus upon that as well?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. He makes a sound point. My third point is simply that we must, as many speakers have said, boost industrial production. The $2 billion for stockpiles that are there to re-equip Ukraine and replenish our own forces was allocated in the spring budget last year in 2023. By the end of last year, only a third of that sum had been committed and none of it had been spent. And I say to the Minister, I've now been waiting 4 months for an update on the progress with committing and spending that £2 billion. It must be fast-tracked. It must be used for stockpiles. It can't be used, as the NAO was concerned about, to fill budget gaps in the defence budget. We've got to reboot our industrial strategy, grow our defence base at home, and further collaboration with Ukraine and allies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're proud of the UK's leadership on Ukraine. The Ukrainians have told us how important that bipartisan support is to them. As the President's Chief of Staff said to us, the UK elections are the only ones we're not worried about this year. So on military support for Ukraine, the government, and in reinforcing NATO allies, the government has had and will continue to have Labour's fullest support. And I conclude by returning to where I started, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The charity Save Ukraine told us that there are well over 20,000 Ukrainian children who remain stolen and in Russian hands or in Russian territory. But they are determined to bring every single one of them home to their families, home to their country. And across this House, our determination must be just as strong to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to win.
Minister, Leo Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it's been a powerful and sincere debate, and I'm very grateful for the contributions from across the House. The Shadow Foreign Secretary started by reflecting on his recent visit, talking about the courage of the Ukrainian people, and pointing out that it is indeed a critical moment, and a moment at which Putin believes he can outlast the democracies of this world. And of course we, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will disprove that assumption. The Shadow Foreign Secretary asked 3 important questions. Firstly, about deliveries needing to be speeded up. We are straining every sinew to expedite the delivery of lethal aid, and taking this year our contributions from £2.5 billion up to 3. He asked about UK diplomacy accelerating. I can give him that assurance that is the case across the G7, the NATO summit in Washington in July, the EPC, and of course the Ukraine Peace Summit. And I can't comment on the Prime Minister's diary, but I know that will be attended to at the very highest level. He asked also about seizure of state assets and sanctions. Of course, the G7 summit coming up in June will be the critical moment, and as the Prime Minister himself has said, we and our G7 partners must be bold and pursue all routes through which immobilised Russian sovereign assets can be used to support Ukraine in line with international law. So the direction of travel is clear, and we are expediting that work. We should also have no embarrassment about our remarkable and decisive contribution to Ukrainian security. Those who visit from UK to Ukraine should hold their heads high in regard to us being very proud of the contributions we have made to the protection of Ukrainian sovereignty. My right honourable friend, the member for Harwich and North Essex, made a characteristically very knowledgeable speech, and pointed out about and laid out the contest of wills that is underway in Ukraine, and spoke interestingly about the new role of the new Defence Minister Belousov, and how that should make us concerned about the wholesale Russian mobilisation for a greater war footing. He pointed out also that it's a global crisis, not just a regional one, and that's a very important context in which to understand it. The honourable gentleman for Angus also confused me when he said that he was impartial. I know he didn't mean it like that. He didn't mean it in that sense. But he rightly pointed out the concern that we should have over Russian military might. He asked about the refining loophole with regards to exports of hydrocarbons, and I can assure him that a huge amount of diplomatic and technical work has been done with delegations right across the Middle East, Central Asia and the Caucasus to ensure that countries at risk of sanction circumvention change their policy to ensure that they are not exploited. My honourable friend for Filton and Bradley State made a characteristically knowledgeable description of the military situation and the huge military-industrial challenge. His mention of the capabilities in his own constituency was very welcome. And of course, the huge amount of resource and energy we are putting into supplying resource to the Ukrainians to develop their drone capability also attends to our own very consequential drone strategy and our commitment of £10 billion over the next 10 years for increased supplies of our own munitions, because this is in terms of the context of needing to ramp up industrial capabilities, not just in terms of supply for Ukraine, but in terms of backfilling our own capabilities, because indeed we have an important role in what he termed, and I welcomed it, the arsenal of the free world. The Honourable Gentleman for Carden gave some welcome comments on his personal experience. He also pointed out the role of China and the hydrocarbon relationship with Ukraine, which was very important, and the important role played by the so-called Eurasian economic sphere, because that economic context and the hugely consequential deposits of titanium and lithium in Ukraine make it potentially a very important global player in its longer-term economic development, which is important in terms of its own, in terms of the way we understand its capacity for its own reconstruction. My right honourable friend, the member for the Cotswolds, pointed out that this is a critical moment in this conflict, but also pointed out that the regional context, and his welcome of Moldova was very welcome. We recognise the critical challenge faced by that country, but also he should be assured that we are putting a huge amount of political and technical energy into supporting Moldova on building its state institutions. He urged more work on the diplomatic front, which we are doing. He talked about the importance of air capability and also the importance of more grain flowing through the Black Sea, which is actually as a consequence of the remarkable military gains achieved by the Ukrainians, often with remote, uncrewed maritime vessels, which is basically illustrative of a remarkable revolution in warfighting, of which we should also know. Delighted to give way. Yes.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend giving way. Having looked on the Public Accounts Committee in great detail at how we built capacity during the COVID pandemic to build up capacity for producing vaccines, would he look at the lessons learnt in that campaign? In particular, what we did during that campaign was to invest directly in capacity, not through the firms that were producing, but directly in capacity. Would he look at that as a method as how we could rapidly build up our military capabilities?
That is one of the things we are looking at. I was very grateful to the Honourable Member for St Helens and South and Whiston. She spoke about it being Europe's war, not just America's, which I thought was an interesting contextual point. She spoke about the brutality in Bucha and the strategic importance of Ukrainian victory, which was welcome. The Right Honourable Gentleman from Gainsborough made a provocative but very sincere speech, and he asked the question, do we have the resolve to win? And I think the House answered that question with a resounding yes, we do have that resolve. The Honourable Gentleman from Leeds North West made a very welcome historical point, putting in context the journey of statehood of Ukraine in terms of the Viking establishment of Kevan and the Scythians in the Crimea, and also the ancient grain-based relationship with Europe, which is a very, very interesting insight and disputes much of the propaganda coming out of the Kremlin. He also pointed out the human cost of the war in Ukraine. The Honourable Gentleman from Tiverton and Honiton spoke about the chauvinism of the Russian state, which I thought was a good way to put it. He outlined his party's support for our policy, for which I was very grateful. And he also drew an interesting and relevant parallel, I think, to the Russian experience of their invasion of Afghanistan. The Right Honourable Member for North Durham paid tribute to the tenacity of the Ukrainian people. He also pointed out that, of course, really the first invasion was 2014, and in terms of understanding the geopolitical journey of Ukraine, 1992 in Lisbon and 1994 in Budapest are very important dates which we must all recognise when we consider our own posture. The views of his fellow members of the NATO parliamentary delegation from Eastern Europe and Baltic states were very welcome because they are highly relevant. And of course, I agree with him that increased defence spending is not an indication of warmongering. No, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is the surest safeguard of peace. My honourable friend from Strangford talked about the importance of the struggle of the whole nation, which I thought was a good way of putting it. He spoke about the brutality of Russian forces and the threats of Baltic states, and also the horrendous impact on the education of young people in Ukraine, which will surely last a generation. I was very grateful to the Shadow Defence Secretary, who made some welcome reflections on his recent visit last week to Ukraine and the horrific experience of particularly young people, and the two examples he gave of those kidnapped and sent to camps, told that Ukraine does not exist. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this whole House knows that, of course, Ukraine does exist, and it's proved that in magnificent fashion over the last 2 years to the tyrannical invader. I was grateful, as ever, to the Right Honourable General for reiterating his support for the government's policy and the unity reflected across the whole House this evening of our resolve and unity across the political divide. And, of course, the scale of the challenge. He mentioned the 800 miles of front line, which indicates the scale of the redoubtable Ukrainian military. I can give him assurance in terms of answering his three questions that are energetic and dynamic support in terms of supplying military, lethal aid and military support, and training will continue. And our effort in that quarter is reflected in the increase of resource therein, so from £2.5 to £3 billion this year. Our energy in that quarter will be matched by our diplomacy across the landscape of important diplomatic events this year, which I've already mentioned. And we will sincerely carry out a ramping up of industrial production, and I give him a commitment that we will keep him and his colleagues across the floor updated as that is expedited. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Putin's war has demonstrated one thing above all others, that he will never be able to subdue the will of Ukrainians to be Ukrainian, which is why he should end his unwinnable war and the hideous suffering he's inflicting on Ukrainians and Russians by withdrawing his forces. Putin should also know that this is not the outcome Ukraine and its allies are planning for. In January, the Prime Minister and President Zelensky signed a historic 100-year partnership, and more of our allies are following suit. Since Putin's invasion of Crimea, we have helped train over 65,000 Ukrainian military personnel. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, we've sent almost 400 different military capabilities, and it will be, in terms of resource value, £3 billion this year. And we're making long-term investments in Ukraine's security in the air, on land and at sea, including by hosting this week a forum with Ukrainian defence companies. So taken together, our current support will help keep Ukraine in the fight. Our continued support and diplomacy will ensure they prevail, and our long-term support and cooperation will help them rebuild their country, strengthen its defences, deter future aggression. And Putin thinks he can outlast us, but he should be in no doubt. The United Kingdom will stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. As many of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The occupant of this chair, as you know, is always completely impartial. However, the sentiments of the House are quite clearly unanimous on this issue. Slavo-Ukrainian. We now come to motion number 2 relating to the Petitions Committee. Sir Bill Wiggins.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Ayes have it.